Good evening and welcome to the Lawless broadcast. It's the 30th of December and we're here for an end of year special of the Lawless broadcast. Joining me are Louise O'Donnell and John Waters, two titans of Irish public life. And a number of the, I don't know, Louise doesn't like that description, but anyway, a number of people watching this will be very familiar with John. He's been a bit of a fixture on this platform. But Louise, if you don't mind, would you just describe yourself to people who mightn't know who you are and how do you identify yourself and your role in Irish life now and in the past?
Well, my role in Irish life, I don't know. My role in my own life at the moment is one of silence. I suppose, how would I describe myself? I don't know. I suppose at the bottom of everything I've ever done in the last, how many years, I was basically a teacher. You know, I taught teachers, I taught in universities, I wrote a bit. And my background would be really in the arts. I was trained in the arts from the time I was very young because I had a parent who worked in the arts. So I was around music and poetry and drama. So if I was to describe myself, I'd be more oral than written. I'm a storyteller, I suppose. Good teachers are good storytellers. I worked a bit in politics and in the Senate for 9 years, which again is with the privilege of being a speaker, again a storyteller within the Senate, except that we were involved in a lot of legislation. I'm a survivor, I suppose. I had a child on my own in the 80s, and I'm a single mother as well. So I don't think it was discovered, feminism, in the 80s, nor the 90s, nor the 2000s. I was discovered many years ago by good nun teaching. What am I? I survivor, a woman, still here. But basically, I suppose, an oral. My background would be with that of the oral and the oral, and I would be, in the best sense, I hope, an inspirational teacher because I was inspired by them when I was young. And an observer. And a very good observer of Irish life, culture, people, and how we breathe and where our hearts are, or we think they are. So is that's
satisfactory? Yeah.
I don't know.
I think that's pretty good. And
you with a bit obviously of sense of humor.
Yeah. What was that thing you said there?
And a bit of a sense of humor.
Yes.
So it's very important. It's very
important.
And spiritual. Exactly. And spiritual. And I believe in that.
Well, your mother has clearly been a huge part of your life. And do you think you'll ever get to touch her again now with all that's going on? Like, what are your interactions with her like?
Well, they're through windows, and now they're not even through the window. But my mother, interesting enough, is 97 and said, "I don't want to come to the window again," in one full sentence, having not spoken for about a year. And I said, "Why not, Mommy?" And I don't like it. It's not right. I said, "You're completely correct about that, but I'm not in a position to have those kind of conversations with her anymore. She'll take everything in, and I don't want to undermine." She's with the nuns, she's with the Little Sisters of the Poor, who have that moment of finish on everything they do. You know, even the way they present meals to my mum, you know, the way they present a tray. I mean, it's very important because older people were used to a knife and a fork and a serviette and a cup and the standard, their finish even on the bedspread and the way they put the flowers. Those small things mean an awful lot because it is confinement. And I have learned I bring my own pathology now to what I'm saying because my experience of growing old in Ireland, being in my late 60s myself, my mother in her late 70s, I'm experiencing an Ireland that is completely different to the one I thought it was going to be. And there are thousands of people like my mother in fact, the Alone report said there was 12,000 elders. I call them elders because in the Greeks usually the people of Corinth or Athens were elders who tried to convince the king of something, and he was never taking their advice in the end. And when the city was fell, then the chorus would come back on the stage of elders and say, "Why didn't you listen to me?" So I consider my mother to be full of wisdom of life, you know, and they're not listened to. And there's a presumption that if one gets old, one's mind is old when it could be alive, totally alive and young. So I see her through a window. I have much to say about that, and I know you don't want to talk about the elders and how we're treating people, but the Alone report, to go back on that, said that there were 12,000 elders in residential nursing homes who didn't need to be there. Now that says something about what we should be doing in the communities and at home, and giving people the facility to mind at home, if it's possible. I mean, I know it's not possible in some situations, but Mum anyway is there, and she has what I haven't got, not yet anyway. She has a tremendous sense of acceptance, and it floors me every time I speak to her or talk to her or talk at her or look at her, and the sense of acceptance of her age and where she is, and not interfering or making our lives troublesome, traumatized. She understands trauma. And so she is silent in her acceptance of her situation, because we tried for 3 years, we tried to mind her and we couldn't. So it's a sadness for me and a grace for me and a memory. And I get extremely sad when I leave. And then I'm fine because I know she's fine, but it's not easy.
No.
But it's not easy for 1,000 different reasons. Like, it's not just growing old. That isn't easy because you're not allowed to grow old now, you see. You can't grow old. In America, you won't even get buried,
Yes.
You can look
and this is at a time when Ireland does have an aging population, but so the problem is,
we're not paying attention to it. We're paying medical attention, but we're not paying social and artistic attention. There's no sense in Ireland where the arts should be an absolute. They should just be part of life in residential homes. The same way as physiotherapy is, the same way as washing your hands, sanitizing everything is, and meals are. I mean, there are hundreds of artists and performers and out of work plays should be rehearsed there, orchestra should be there, quintets, quartets. I keep saying this, that it should be a creative and social model should be number one, and the medical model should follow that. But we have it in reverse. But it's very hard.
We spoke. Sorry, I'm jumping over here. What was that very last thing?
No, but just that we have it in reverse, and you need energy, you need passion and energy to pilot that, and it's done in a piecemeal. Somebody comes in and plays a guitar out of tune, and the elders are supposed to think that was a great day out. It's rubbish. It's rubbish. And I mean, I'm not against volunteers. They're outstanding, the people who do work. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just thinking it should be a statutory requirement that if you are in a residential home, that you should have all the facilities, and you should be able to have nature, that you have an expectation of beauty, an expectation of sound, and an expectation of music and voice. And that it shouldn't. Why should it disappear? I think I gave you this example before, and there was a quintet came to play in a kind of in the middle of a
courtyard.
A courtyard, exactly. A courtyard of actually was a residential home, and the elders came to the windows during COVID, and it was like they had given them gold. The music they played, and they were absolutely enthralled and enraptured. I think that should be a requirement. I think the Arts Council were sitting there giving out money, just giving out like a kind of an artistic bank. Why isn't there a place for that? Why aren't all artists, all people who express for a living, who read for a living, read aloud, who dance, who create puppetry, who write poetry, who rehearse, why isn't part of all of that? It's easily done. It's as good as a vaccination.
In that it would be life-giving.
I've tried. It's very difficult. And some homes do it, but you might have somebody, who's kind of passionate about it and can pursue it, But it should be if you have to go in, and people do, and it's right that they, that they're minded and safe and warm and looked after, because families can't do it, or for whatever the reason, that they should have that facility. I think it's important. Of course, the arts have take second place anyway to mathematics. We all know that.
And we'll come to that. a year ago, Máire Louise, you and I spoke about the religious experience in Ireland. I don't know if you remember that conversation in detail, but you mentioned, or we both mentioned, the act of walking or kneeling up Croagh Patrick. And John, I want to ask you about your experience on Croagh Patrick in July of 2020, if you don't mind. Can you set the scene of what went on there on Reek Sunday and the significance of that and the part that you played in that event?
Well, the event was really by way of marking the occasion of Reek Sunday at a time when it had been cancelled by the church. And as it happened on the day, the guards were all over Murrisk and the village nearby, and they had every parking place was closed off. The car park was open, but it's a relatively small car park. But all the places along the road that people would park were blocked off with, what do you call those things, yellow cones. And so we wanted to simply be there to mark this day because it seemed to us to be important. And so we went up. I didn't climb the Reek because my health is not what it was. I went up as far as the shrine on the, it's about a few hundred yards up, and I spoke up there. So it was really an act of just, I won't say defiance, but it was an act of registering a protest and an acknowledgement of the significance of this. And that you know, it seemed to me to be, this whole thing seemed to be a part of a pattern, which maybe we'll go into later on, that was behind all of this COVID business. That it, you know, it wasn't from the very beginning clearly about health at all. It was about other things and fundamentally about controlling people. And it seems to me now to be about breaking the spirit of people on a global basis. I'm not saying that the people administering here, they're working a protocol which says at the top, you know, saving lives. I will, you know, give them the credit to believe or to accept that they think that's what they're doing, but it isn't what they're doing. They're destroying the spirit of the people. And that is the objective behind it. That's the purpose. That's how the protocol is written. And that's why it is written. And, you know, so that was really what Croagh Patrick was about, what that day in July was about. I worked in Westport many years ago in the railway station. And, you know, I used to go out there and, you know, it means a lot. It is, as I said in the day, it is, in a certain sense, Ireland's Calvary. And it is, you know, that's our history goes back to this place, and our modern history goes back to it, our Christian history, our Christian civilizational history. And it seemed to me to be important that it be acknowledged. So that was really why I wanted to do that. And I'm just interested in what Máire Louise is saying there, because I do think that's really important. You know, I've kind of been unlucky in my life in this respect, that when I was young, it was unfashionable to be young and it was fashionable to be old. And now that I'm growing old, it's only fashionable to be young and the old are to be disregarded. And I don't mean that I mean, if you think back, well, you wouldn't remember, Fergus, but Máire Louise would, that, you know, 30, 40 years ago on TV, you saw old people all the time. You know, you see Siobhan McKenna or Kieran McMahon. I mean, artistic people, Kieran McMahony or Seamus Ennis, and they would be talking, and there would be Gay Byrne would interview them with a reverence for their wisdom, right? And that mirrors something that was true also in the wider society, that almost every home had an old person in it, a grandparent, a man or a woman, and they would come out on a sunny day and sit on the windowsill, you know, and look up and down and talk to people as they passed. And this was like regarded as part of the balance. People didn't talk like this, but it was regarded as a natural part of the natural order of things. This has been obliterated in the last 25, 30 years, whereby there's taken out of sight and hidden away in these, I think, you know, not everybody, I think nursing homes are horrendous places. You know, I've been, anytime I've had to visit anybody there, I had to take to the bed for at least 48 hours afterwards because the experience of that alone, and these wouldn't even be relatives of mine, it was so devastating to me, to my psyche, that, you know, to see, I mean, I was a man, for example, in Mullingar that I met through my work years ago, and I wrote an article about him. He was a wonderful little man. And he had written even a book about James Joyce, and he was a brilliant, brilliant man. And he ended up in this place, and it was just heartbreaking. His few books were on a kind of a sideboard in the room. He was sitting on this bed. It was like a prison cell. His whole life was there and not there. And I don't know, we can do better than this, you know, but we don't run. You see this, if you want to actually characterize that and what COVID is about, they're both about the same thing in this sense. It's a complicated thing, but what it's about fundamentally is saying our country, our politics, our economics, our philosophy, our theology are no longer about serving people. They're no longer about people. They're about serving interests. This is what it's all about. The vaccine is not about making people healthy. It's about selling large amounts of money. It's about the fact that Ireland, for example, is dependent on the pharmaceutical industry for its for economic survival. That's what it's about. We are simply the instruments of their power and their profit making. They are no longer there to serve us, to provide products, to make us healthier, whatever it might be. And so that's an inversion of everything that life is supposed to be about, and public life is supposed to be about, and politics is supposed to be about. And that has happened in Ireland very dramatically, I think, in the last 30 years. Like a moment of rupture occurred when we just flipped. And we ceased to be about ourselves and our own people and about our interests and our lives, the quality of our lives, the beauty of our lives, all those things. And so that's kind of, I suppose, again, you know, going back to Patrick Fergus, I mean, you know, that the idea seemed to be that because people got some joy out of this, it had to be stopped, it had to be suppressed. You know, the idea that you would, you know, spread a virus up on a fucking mountain in a beautiful summer's day is utter nonsense. Whatever about the rest of it, which is also nonsense, but this was utter nonsense. And to hear bishops prating this utter nonsense and having people nod their heads when they should just say, just get out of here. Just get out of here. Shut up and get out of here.
Would you have any sympathy for the fact that the bishops themselves, like, we all know how old Irish clergy are, you know, they're not young men by and large, and that they might feel that, rightly or wrongly, but that their health is in danger by doing their job. Do you know?
If you want to go to bed and stay there, I couldn't care less.
Yes.
I couldn't care less. Just stay out of our lives.
It's interesting that the response of the Catholic Church to COVID has been the odd time for the odd mass, and the 8 people to sit on that side and the 7 people to sit on that side, and only to walk up to get your communion when you're told. They didn't come with any energy either. They didn't come with any help. They didn't surround their people either. They didn't come and help them. You know, they didn't even help them with their voices. They didn't help them with what they were saying. They just heard it in. They should have been a counteraction in some way. And even if they got jailed over, but they should have been a sacred counteraction. They didn't even come with a sacred voice to us and say, just listen here for a minute, you know, or look up here for a minute, or let me talk to you for a second. They didn't even come with poetry. They came with nothing except only 6 can sit here and only 7, and I'm locking this door. And if you want mass, and mass is extremely important to people, young and old, who are believing. Extremely, it's ritualistic. It's like you're in touch with something. You mightn't believe. People might be listening to this that don't believe a word of it. That's fine. But there are those who do. There's something about it that's about the other, and people need the other. And they didn't even give us that.
Yes.
I was disappointed in their lack of the sacred, you know. I was disappointed in that. Whatever about their orthodoxy, you know, and their dogmas and their. My mother used to say, but but it's like, oh, I believe in God. I'm not really interested in what he's saying, you know, on the altar, because he was boring us to death with something. There was something other than that going on. It was a platform or a conduit, you know. We didn't get that. Whereas when the young people were killed in America, do you remember those young people who were on a balcony?
Yes, in
And
Berkeley,
they
yeah.
died in America. Yeah, it was a tragedy, and many of them were very hurt. They had nowhere to go but to the church. Do you remember that? There wasn't. They went. It was the church. I remember that they congregated in, the parents and the relations who came. People need to go somewhere for sustenance. They didn't offer us that sustenance, whether you were believers or not. We weren't offered it, and the spaces are big enough to take hundreds of us without breathing on each other. I found that they didn't stand up for it. They should have stood up.
And
not alone that, Louise, but also, I mean, you just think about it, like people were left. This is partly what the article I've written in the last 24 hours is about. People were left panic-stricken in nursing homes, unable to speak to their loved ones. Now, stress is one of the things it does. It disables the immune system. And there's a very plausible case to be made that the people who died in the nursing homes, over 1,000 of them in the earlier part of the year, mainly died not from anything like COVID or anything like that, but from conditions blowing up because of they had what they call comorbidities, interesting phrase, but because they had these conditions and their immune systems fell down because of stress.
Mm-hmm.
And the church was part of that. The church refused to remember Jesus and the lepers, and refused to remember the gospels they had been drilling into us for year upon year upon year. And not alone that, but when those poor people died, and when anybody died in the last, they were buried, as I wrote, like convicted murderers in the corners of prison yards, all but for the quicklime. That's the way they were buried. What a shameful country we have become. And nobody raised a voice about it. It's a shocking thing. I don't know. You see, one of the things that I can't get my head around anymore is that nobody is shocked by the things I expect them to be shocked by, but they're shocked by nonsense.
Nonsense, absolute, like Connemara golf game nonsense.
Yeah, that kind of nonsense. You know, or if somebody, you know, misspeaks and says, you know, if they say, oh, he's a colored person instead of saying a person of color, that's a shocking thing. Oh my God, what has he said? Oh, sack him, get him sacked immediately.
I know.
But people can be allowed to die alone, if not indeed caused to die alone, which is what my article is about, because that's the back of it. They must have known what would happen when they did this.
Yes, there was a very interesting senator wrote a huge piece, and a very good piece it was too, and well researched, on the power of loneliness to close down people. You know, it was Keith Swanwick. He's a good guy, Keith Swanwick. He's a doctor out in North Mayo, way out North Mayo, probably know. And
yes,
it's quite brilliant because he's seen it, and I think you're talking the absolute devastating power of loneliness. What loneliness can do: close the person down, close it all down, and close the system down, and the energy down, and the joy down. I would agree with you.
Imagine it. Louise, can we imagine it? Just the three of us here now, if we can just briefly try to just think of it and describe. I'll try to describe it. That you live a life with those you love, close to them, confiding in them, every day, ringing them, texting them. They are your life. And then in your final hours, days, weeks, you're cast into this room where they cannot reach you. And you think, this can't be true. No, if I'm going to die, they will do something. If I'm going to die, they will tell me, and they will tell my family, and they will come to me. Yes. No. What kind of a country has this become? Why do we need this church anymore? Tell me, what is it for? It is for nothing.
But yet, John, you are a very religious person. Religious is probably the wrong word. You're a deeply spiritual man, you know.
Yeah, I'll tell you something,
You're
Mary.
not saying, are you saying this church? Are you saying any church?
Well,
or any other? Or any...
No, I'm not saying. I'm saying this church. This church.
This church is winding down, though, isn't it not? It had no
good
bravery over COVID.
And a good thing, too. Yes.
But what's going to replace it, John? What is going to replace it? Because the banks have replaced it in one way. They have replaced it in relation to power. If it had power over the people, if it had power over politics, if it had power over education, if it had power over the way people lived, and it did, because I would have seen it in the towns of Mayo. Okay. What's got the power now in another guise? The banks. The lenders to the great banks have just made 215 billion over the COVID 6 to 8 months in lending fees. Like the rich are getting richer as the COVID, closes, the starting with joy, people down. But so what's going to replace it, John, when the banks conglomerate?
It's a complicated question. It's a complicated question in the sense that I understand what you mean.
Yeah.
But that's not a replacement, obviously.
No, but it is replacing it in relation to power.
I spent many years when I was at the Irish Times trying to open up these questions to no avail, because nobody wanted to talk about these things. And the fundamental thing I was asking is, where can anybody show me the society that has survived for more than 2 generations without a concept of the transcendent? It's not possible. It doesn't happen. So we're actually in a free fall. We're plummeting.
Well, what Thomas Sheridan says has replaced it is the ritual of the virus, of the pandemic and all of that.
Well, you see, that doesn't replace it. That, in fact, it's very interesting. I agree with Thomas that it has extraordinarily religious overtones in a certain sense, that it has, in a sense, co-opted the ritualistic and incantational elements of religion. But actually, in a certain sense, it is an anti-religion. And I want to explain what I mean. That if you actually think back to mythology, to what we know about the very first kind of signs, there were marks that were put on stones and the like by human beings. The mythology that they created out of in their imaginations was about transcendence and community. They were the two most important things: the collective group and their membership of it, and the sense of the possibility of immortality. In whatever way that would be imagined. And so what that did in the beginning, that was actually in the beginning of what you might call a culture religion. This is a complicated thing. I don't want to get into what's true and not true. I'm just simply, this is the way in human history, this is what you see. And so religion dealt with the most fundamental problem that man faced.
Yes.
Imagination, which was death. It dealt with that and has dealt with it in this. We all who grew up in this country have seen it in the most recent past, the way that we deal with death. I mean, I grew up in a town of 2,000 people. This is an interesting thing as well. When people die. They die in December and January, by and large, old people. This happens every year. This in a small town. And then every so often, well, maybe 4 or 5 times in a population that size, somebody would die suddenly that shouldn't die. That would happen as well. So you can see the same patterns emerging in the COVID narrative, but they're given a different explanation. But what I think that COVID has done is it has penetrated into that ancient primal, what they call the lizard brain, where there is no reason, there's only emotion, and the greatest emotion of all is fear. And it has awoken that again in the absence of religion. That it seems to me, is an operation that was timed for the moment when we would be post-Christian in a meaningful sense. And there's other timing aspects too. The Trump thing is a timing thing. The media thing is a timing thing, because it picked the moment when the media was halfway through its free fall into oblivion, but still potent in the sense that it could reach certain people, particularly, interestingly, older people. So I think that Thomas Sheridan is right, but I think the meaning he adduces from it is not the one I would adduce. I think there's what they have actually done is created an anti-religion. They have tapped into the residual, what you might call, it's like the tingling of the amputated limb. It's that kind of tapped into that. And they've actually demobilized it now. And they've made people as terrified again. I mean, you see young men, 22 years of age, going around masked up to the gills, terrified, jumping out of your way, right? I feel like saying, you realize that you have a 1 in 300,000 chance of dying from COVID. But every time you cross a road, a public road in a town, you have a 1 in 700 chance of being killed. Get a life, for Christ's sake, before you're dead.
Okay, do you not think that in one sense that COVID has really, that has pulled some other people, other aspects of us away from freneticism and taught us that it's okay to do nothing. It's okay maybe to look at yourself and maybe reflect on what the hell you're at, and maybe you shouldn't be doing that. No, hold on, maybe you shouldn't be doing that. Maybe you shouldn't be in a car if you're young. Maybe you shouldn't be putting your child into a creche at 6 o'clock in the morning, to go to the work in the bank or wherever. Maybe you should just hold up in a minute here, horse, that maybe I just should be making different decisions here, moving out, moving on, moving away. It's giving people time to rethink, and there are those who will rethink socially how they want to live their lives, and how. Yeah,
but what?
Is that?
What about the cost? What about the cost of it? What about the cost? I mean, look, any change may have the possibility of benefits, but the cost of this is going to be astronomical under innumerable headings. Economic. We're basically now plummeting towards 1929 if we haven't already passed it. And the consequences of that will be life and death consequences in many instances.
I understand, but in one way, yes, I hear what you're saying, but it's kind of bleak. And I'm trying to just find,
well, sometimes, if things are bleak,
but
you have to say it.
I know, and I sometimes, I think, if somebody said to me, where are you emotionally? I'm in the depths of melancholia and have been since I was 5. There has been no change there. It's just that I used to call, I was wondering about why am I not, why do I sound happy, but I'm not really. But so melancholia, I would understand what you're saying, that I'm not looking for.
Yeah.
I'm not looking for a big joyous way out. No. But what I'm saying, I'm just asking the question: is there no benefit from relearning just the freneticism of the way we've been, the pornography of our lives, and the greed and the self-satisfaction and the gimme more and I need more and the shelves and I've got a bit of this and I must have more of that and the vans going up and down the road, and you could start with Amazon and end with Super Value, and you can't get the stuff in fast and more furiously into our houses and mouths.
Mary Louise, like, if you were to speak to that man, Theodore Herriman.
Yes. Yes, I know you're talking
or
about. Or
somebody like Don Tidy, whom I know, and say to them, did you gain anything from your horrific experience of being kidnapped, being terrorized? They'd probably say, yeah, it taught me to value certain things.
Yes.
Does that justify it? Of course not.
Oh, I'm not justifying it. I'm saying that I'm trying to find Jesus, Mary, and Joseph.
But first of all, we need to indict. You see, the problem is we're not indicting the crime or the criminals in this. We can't move to the exculpation.
Well, I can't get a ticket to China because the one thing that Trump said, the China virus, the China virus, the China virus, Wuhan. Oh, and it's not Wuhan anymore now, according to
another story as well. There's another story as well, Marie-Louise, that doesn't involve China. It involves, the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab and his Great Reset. And that's, again, the media are not telling people.
I don't want to use the word conspiracy now, because we'll be down another road here.
I can talk about conspiracies, because conspiracy, every single thing that ever happened in history, from a war to an assassination to a coronation, involved conspiracy.
was some aspect of maybe a conspiracy.
But to understand history, you have to acknowledge. You see, as somebody was saying there recently, you know, a conspiracy is, they only talk about conspiracies when it's poor people who are speaking. When it's rich people who are speaking, it's strategic planning.
Oh, I mean, I could name about 15 conspiracies within the bank. So yeah. I know exactly what you're talking about. But
yeah. So
anyway, go ahead. You were saying.
I explained this before. It's a very interesting thing. This we have to. You see, this conspiracy theory is a spell phrase, and it's very interesting. A spell phrase is one which is like a cattle prod. It causes people to recoil from something. You know the way the cattle, when they touch the wire, they back off very fast. Conspiracy theory is designed that way. And it's designed actually by the CIA. Now, when you think about it, conspiracy, as I say, conspiracy is there somebody conspiring or not? You could have a good conspiracy, a bad conspiracy. Theory, interesting. Now, you think of those two words. One of them has a sinister undertone. That's the word conspiracy. But the phrase conspiracy theory takes all the sinister aspects of the word conspiracy and dumps them on the theory and the theorist. So we're not any longer. So as soon as you hear it, you're no longer looking who's doing this terrible thing, who's planning this, diabolical event. We're thinking, why is this guy saying that somebody is planning some diabolical event? It's a very clever trick. Fiendish.
Yeah, get that distinction. Yeah. Funny enough, but nobody's asking the question. I don't have lots of discussion. I don't see or hear lots of any discussion on how did this all happen? How did this all? Nobody's having that discussion.
But Máire, the media will not permit any. There are lots of discussions online, all over YouTube.
You just don't see them.
Yeah. But not on the mainstream media. Absolutely not. No.
I want to ask.
Yeah.
I want to ask Máire Louise, because the narratives on this are so in tune, in unison, right? Louise, I want to ask you about your son's experience of this in his job, basically, as how much strain do you think he has seen? Because listening to John, it sounds like this is a complete and utter fabrication. And watching the news, you are led to believe that the system is overwhelmed and we can't cope and all that. So do you mind me asking about his experience or your experience of his experience?
Well, he doesn't tell me about his patients, and he doesn't tell me about his work in the hospitals or that. He doesn't speak about it, but he has seen very awful situations, and he has seen, because he's in the area of neurology, he has seen what he would call COVID accentuating people's neurological difficulties, problems, strokes, all of those areas. And he has found it very, very difficult. I think the most difficult thing about it, he said, is the fact that they're very alone, and that it's a hard one for me to answer, because I would not give away, he doesn't speak about it, but I've seen the strain on him. I mean, he was staying at home here because he's trying to save for a house and all of that stuff, but we had to get out, and we had to get an apartment because he was terrified that I'd get it. It terrorized him. They were terrorized around. They're young. He's in his 30s. He's young senior registrar, but he's still very young in the area of medicine, and they were on the front line in the Mater and in the Vincents, and he was terrified for me because they were terrorized around him. And it's more calm now because he got COVID, and he was very unwell with a flu, a very, very bad flu, and got very unwell and was out for about 17 days, and was actually said afterwards to me, I'm glad I'm over it. I'm glad I got it, and I'm over it, and I can go back now, and I am waiting for it to happen. I'm waiting, and then seeing colleagues of his who got very sick and colleagues of his who weren't sick at all, and seeing people die and see people going out in body bags and no visitors and no this and no. And he said, it was just awful. And the Mater was a very epicenter, and still is, of the area. And then he would point out as well, and John would be, I know what I'm talking about here, he would have mentioned this himself just in this last sentence, that people who mightn't have had, people from communities who have to live 4 and 5 and 6 to a room, or don't, the lower socioeconomic disadvantaged communities would be more susceptible to this, would have lack of education, lack of knowledge, or working in the bone factories, and in agricultural meat factories. And so he would saw a whole sociological divide as well. And of course, obviously, the elders. But so I'm generalizing because it's difficult for me, but I did see, I saw him at one stage in a job that he thought he was going to love, and he does love, become fearful and trepidatious and nervous and not on the Lewis and walk and the bicycle and stand back and forward. This was in the first close down, and now we're coming near that, more mature now, but I can see that he saw a sign of medicine that he might have seen if he had been out in maybe a village in Africa with a polio epidemic or something. But John makes another point to this, you see, that did people die because of COVID, or did people die? COVID was just another of the aspects that killed them. They died of pneumonia, or they died of, as they got older, and they die, they get older, and they mainly die of pneumonia, or they die of kidney failure or liver failure, or whatever. But did it accentuate it, or was it the cause? I don't know. He never.
Well, I mean, for example, can I just, over 4,000 every year, over 4,000 Irish people die from respiratory conditions.
Yes.
Over 6,000 people die from smoking related illness.
That's right.
Some of them maybe the same people.
Diabetes.
Now, spread them over a month, you have a hell of a lot of statistics there. Now, people always died of the flu, elderly people in particular. They died, or they, at least in the flu season, they died. That's what I said earlier. If you live in a small town, you see this pattern. I mean, because when I was a child, my father had an absolute kind of a kink about funerals. When somebody died that he knew, or somebody in the town, even if he didn't know them very well, he would insist on being represented at their funeral and sending a mass card. And I was, from a very early young age, I was actually sent along to do this. I was his aide-de-camp, and I would arrive with the mass card, and I would have to get a sign for the priest. So I spent I know this is a bit macabre, but I spent a lot of my time as a child and as a teenager going to funerals. So I took in a lot about the patterns and all that, and the sadness of it. Now, you see, my belief is there's a number of factors. I think the panic, the stress is a huge factor. And that's media generated and WHO generated. There's the appropriation of we've had lots and lots of instances of people who've been claimed. We've heard stories of families who said that, if they had difficulty getting the body released of a loved one, they were told, if you put down COVID, there's no problem. If you don't, there's a problem, maybe a couple of weeks. This kind of thing. There's been all kinds of falsification going on. That's the first thing I would say. Second thing I would say, people always died of flus. Mary Louise there used the phrase that he had a flu. They keep telling it, it's not the flu, it's not the flu. Well, it's flu-like, yes? If we had never heard the word coronavirus, which I think most of us hadn't until a year ago, we would, if we got something, you'd say, I have a dose of the flu. And sometimes, I mean, I've had terrible doses of the flu. I had one time, I think it was actually at the time of the swine flu. I don't know if it was swine flu, but I was in bed for 3 months. Couldn't move. It's not like illness and death didn't suddenly get invented last March. It's like we're talking like they did. You know what I mean? And if you actually think about it, it's like a conjuring trick that they're using stuff that's in plain sight that has happened through history. If you go back, I mean, the other day, somebody was sending me some links for all the number, I can't remember the exact numbers now, but some astronomical number of people that were waiting lists in hospitals and ICU beds and all that. So I said, oh yeah, that looks shocking. Then you do a Google search, you put in 2017, you put in 2040. You get figures which are actually higher, but nobody noticed. Nobody knew, nobody spoke about it. Like we've heard for years about people on trolleys in hospitals, hundreds of them in the height of the flu season. Why is nobody mentioning that now? Why is it only COVID? Like, it's the most extraordinary thing that people.
You're right.
It
has been a recurring. Yeah. It has been a recurring thing in Irish. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Yeah, and in fact, the number of ICU beds has been reduced over the years quite dramatically. And that's another factor. And I would say,
no, can I just say this
to the best of my knowledge, sorry.
Yes, sorry.
Yes. No, yeah, sorry. Just to add this, to the best of my knowledge, there has been no increase in ICU beds since last spring. Now, why not?
My son would say that, and I don't want to be talking about him, but he would say that the biggest problem is the fact that they have let the health decline to such an extent that it is a system that is so fragile that it is not able, if something happens like this, or if we get an epidemic of flu or an epidemic of obesity or an epidemic of diabetes or whatever. He said it's just not able. It's too fragile. We will not fill the posts. We don't know where the money is going. It's all into a hole. You know, and there's millions and millions and millions and millions, and there's posts not filled, and people will tell you they can't get this, they can't get that, they can't get the other, cancer patients, this patient, that patient, the other patient, transplant patients, patients waiting for this, that, and the other. And he said it is so fragile that to make it anything that would rattle it, that's the problem. It's a major problem.
I agree.
Okay. To roost. Okay. Yeah. But I said I'd like to ask you a question.
All that accepted. You see, there's a very interesting thing that happens here, Marie-Louise and Fergus. We follow a certain line of logic, and that's clear, and there's no disputing that, what you've said there. The problem is that why did somebody think that locking people up might be a solution? Why, in all of our history, have we had these kind of problems and everybody thought about dealing with them medically, logistically, you know, in terms of, you know, staff, in terms of resources? Where on earth does the idea, completely unproven and still unproven, that locking people in their homes, that curtailing people's movements, that terrorizing them as they go about their business with police activity and so forth, that is a remedy for any of the things we're talking about? It's an absolutely absurd proposition.
But they totally believe that if you do that you will hold on to the capacity within the ICU and within the very traumatized centres, because we only have a certain amount of them. And then we can't.
Do you remember, Marie-Louise, 2 weeks to flatten the curve? When was that? When was that? You see? Do you see what I mean? Like, there's something here that we're not. You see, okay, can I come to the bottom line here? We do not have. Are you
back to Dominic Cummings then? Are you back to Dominic Cummings that the way around this is herd immunity? Do nothing. And the weak will die out and the strong will survive. Is that what you're back to?
Well, the fact of it is that governments cannot stop a virus.
Well, that's a fairly big statement. And
but they seem to,
right.
It's true.
But John, to be fair, whatever about the morality of this, it seems they're keeping it under wraps in Australia and New Zealand by their measures of just not letting anyone in. Maybe it's too late in the day to talk about that kind of elsewhere, but they do seem to have.
Well, that's very interesting, because if you go back to March, there's two very interesting things that happened in March, which I think tell us a lot about this. And it's interesting you bring that up, Fergus. The first was, there was a football match between Italy and Ireland, a rugby match, I think, scheduled for March the 8th, I think it was a Saturday. And it was cancelled about a week in advance. But the flights containing all of the spectators weren't stopped. Nobody stopped them. So the entire point of the exercise was cancelled, was annulled by the secondary decision not to cancel the flights, because they all came and they went around Dublin and drank their heads off for the weekend, spreading whatever diseases they had. And then they went back to Italy. That's the first thing. Now, the second thing is this, and this is, the second thing is interesting as well, and even more because it's a bigger point. And I just want to, as a preface, I want to say, well, okay, you know, we know the sensibility that you meet illness with? What is it? It's compassion. It's kindness. It's tenderness, right? I mean, if you had a flu, even if you were in a workplace with somebody and they came in coughing and sneezing, your first instinct wasn't be, get out of here, you're going to kill me, you know? It would be, are you okay? Can I get you anything? You know, would you try a hot whiskey? I'd run across the road and get a nagging. You know, whatever. That was right. Now, what was the first thing I noticed about the official response to COVID-19? The first formal official statement by a senior figure in Irish life. On the 6th of March, this is the first time. Nobody have died. There had been a couple of cases, 2 cases, I think, at this stage. 6th of March, the Garda commissioner, I would say gleefully, announced that he would very soon have the power to arrest and detain people who refused to be quarantined, who had COVID-19, who are suspected of having COVID-19. Now, you tell me, does that sound to you like they're actually preparing in case people get ill, that they want to look after people? That they want to be kind to people?
John,
Does that sound anything like that?
Yeah, John, isn't one of the things, well, I suppose it was one of the things I learned from Brian Lennon. I found him very interesting. I only met him once. I did a piece on him for the paper at one stage. And why am I telling you about him? Oh, yes, he spoke about, I asked him about politics. He was dying at the time, you know, and I was asking him about his life and about politics. And he was really Benedictine. He read a lot, and he was a very clever fellow.
Was this old Brian or young Brian?
Young Brian. Young Brian,
yes.
Young Brian, who died.
Yes.
Young Brian. He was the only guy who was re-elected in Dublin. Do you remember when Fianna Fáil lost in 2000?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I do. Yeah.
And he was talking about what you were talking about earlier on in our conversation, private enterprise versus public interest, private enterprise taking over, and the public, the compassion of the public and to the public being decreased, and the decrease was quite enormous in that. But I was going to have gone off, so I'm going to tell you something he said there. It's gone out of my head, Fergus.
Louise, I think you said before, he said the Irish are quite lawless. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, that's exactly right. He said, if you want to learn something about Irish politics, said you have to understand that the Irish are completely and entirely lawless. And I thought, Jesus. Oh, he said, absolutely, they disobey laws. Now, I could put, in relation to that, John, do you not think that it is, when it's politics has to answer the common good, it has to answer public health and the public good. You might like those terms, and they might do it all the wrong way, but don't they try to do the right thing, maybe for the wrong reasons, or unlike Thomas à Becket, the right thing for the wrong reasons. But they have to take the public good into account, and they have to try and protect. No, am I wrong? I'm only getting an argument.
Well,
I'm not saying I believe
you're wrong. I don't say you're wrong.
No, I know, but I don't want to be frustrating as well either,
This is what I say. That
we are lawless.
There is no proof, no evidence
this is
that lockdown actually has any effect whatsoever. If you were to, and I could show you this with a graph. If you take the spike of deaths, which somewhere in the middle of April, it reached its peak and went down very quickly within 2 to 3 weeks. So that meant that you were dealing with, at the height of the spike of deaths, with infections that had come about a month earlier. In other words, about the middle of March. That was before any measure introduced by coercion or by governmental diktat. There's no connection. That same pattern can be seen in every country, every jurisdiction in the world. There is no evidence of any correlation between the nature of the lockdown, the nature of the response, draconian or light touch, whatever it may be, and the number of deaths. What you tend to see is that societies either get their spike of deaths early or they get it late. That it seems the virus will have its way no matter what. And that this is all, at the best, you could say, it's futile. But actually, I would say that it's actually ulterior. It has an ulterior motive. And that's the point of it. The virus.
I would leave you on the ulterior motive, but I think there is a futility in it, and that is causing enormous mental problems, emotional problems, and lack of certainty and lack of assuredness. And people are traumatized, and I don't like to use the word everything's emotional, but they're intellectually traumatized as well. They are socially traumatized by this as communicating beings. So, but I leave you on I agree with you there, absolutely. But I'm not too sure. I have to leave you.
Well, that's a bigger, I understand that, Máire. It's a big story and I know a lot about it, but
you do, and I agree with you, you do.
But the problem is we live in a society that no longer has a media. It's media. We have a media which is no longer doing what it was established to do, what its mastheads tell us it does. It has flipped its product. When I was a journalist, the objective of media was to try to tell the truth to the people about what happened yesterday. Now, it seems to me the product is something like they will tell the public what the government wants them to hear today. That's not what newspapers are for. And what has actually happened is that the profession of journalism has basically left its post. It is no longer a watchdog on behalf of society. There are no discussions. The first week, there should have been, the journalists should have been all over.
Discussion like this?
Yes, like this. A very interesting thing, Máire, you might have noticed this, and I won't mention names, but you know who I mean. The kind of journalist that maybe I used to be one at one point, who would write the weekly think piece. Do you know what the think piece is?
Yes, I know who you're talking about, yes.
Yes. Very great absence of think pieces during the COVID. Have you noticed? No think pieces at all.
Well, Trump trumped everything, didn't he? He trumped everything. We started in the dictionary with appalling, and we got to misogyny and then to xenophobia. Yeah, and every day it was an attack on Trump. Yes. And I used to think, are these people looking in the mirror? You know, it was an attack on Trump, regardless of what he was. He was the greatest evil. He contained every moment of evil ever thought of in his stomach. Did Donald Trump? Jesus, he's carrying around a lot of evil.
I saw your other interview with Fergus, and I thought you made some really interesting points about that whole thing. I totally agree with you, or broadly agree with you about Trump on that basis. I think that, you know, he is a very interesting figure.
Oh, massively interesting.
He's a mythological figure.
Totally. With no sense of, you know, he hasn't learned the form of things. It's here it is. You know, here is it. You want an epic? I'll give you an epic.
Yeah, but you also can't.
I didn't get it.
You can't really talk about Trump without talking about Trump's people. This is all about Trump's people. It's about the people that Trump identified, which is like about half of the population of America. The people who are pushed aside by modernity. The people who actually work with their hands, who make and mend the world every day.
You're completely correct.
I want to come in here, if I may, and John, quote, if I'm not mistaken, your first book. This is your first book, isn't it? Jiving at the Crossroads.
Yes.
And because I want to talk about education, and Louise, it looks like she's going to get her coffee.
Go ahead.
But I want to talk about education and the role that education has in the world today. And John, your experience of education, or lack thereof, and Louise, your experience of education and how that might have shaped you. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read a bit of Jiving at the Crossroads. And Louise, if you don't mind, I want you to tune in here, because I think you'll have something, I don't know, to say about it. My father, this is John Waters writing in 1991. My father wanted me to study agriculture at the Regional Tech in Sligo. I was interviewed and gained a place, but something in me resisted what I suspected he was guiding me towards. I refused to go, and for several months, not a word was exchanged between us. Eventually, I got a job as a clerk with CIE. I've always suspected that my father used whatever political pull he possessed to secure it for me, our crowd being in power for a change. My first posting was in the railway station at Claremorris, mainly cross-checking dispatches of bacon by rail from Claremorris Bacon Factory. It would be at least a year before I would begin to get over the shock. Whatever vague imaginings I might have had as a teenager about my future destiny, they did not include sorting through piles and piles of greasy invoices in search of stray bales of bacon and taking abuse from a pig-voiced man in the bacon factory, as was now my daily lot. So, John, I wonder, would you have been able to quote that, verbatim or whatever, or off by heart. But Máire Louise, we spoke earlier about training to become a journalist and how one might be advised to go about that. And we spoke about, are there the facilities, are there the mechanisms in place in the education system to train people to be journalists? And it's funny to bring John up because John spent a long time as a journalist, and a prolific one at that, but he didn't go to college. So you wonder what's going on there, and what's the right way to go about it. I know it's a broad question, obviously.
That's a question. I think sometimes the universities have sold young people kind of lies in lots of their departments. I mean, I can't speak for the sciences because they're very practical, and engineering and medicine and that, and you really learn by mentoring there. In journalism, I went to work in the School of Journalism in DCU because they closed the Teacher Training College, one of the finest teacher training colleges in Ireland, Kerrysford Teacher Training College, and I had taught there. And we were replaced, and I ended up in DCU in the School of Journalism. And I said, I have nothing to offer here. I said, this is not my area. But I began to teach radio, but I had come from an oral background. So I used to teach students about sound. I didn't teach them about being political journalists, but I taught them how to make documentaries, which were really dramas brought to life by voices and sound, and I taught them about all kinds of sound. And I went to the BBC and trained myself in radio so I could come back and do it. Now, that's not a show off moment. That's really that I thought people, but I found up there that there was wonderful people, but journalism, anything I ever did that I felt was of any use, I was able to smell the street. I did it from smelling the street and going out and getting it and finding it. Now, I hope I came with some form because I'd done a bit of reading and I did a degree in English and all that. But I came with some kind of grammatical form. I could put a sentence together or I could speak. You need some form, but in the end, you need the practical application of your imagination. You need that glint and glisten. And you need a mentor, maybe a good mentor with you, or sees something in you. Paddy Kavanagh said it. You just need somebody to put you on the right road, save you a lot of trouble. But the schools and media used to set themselves up, and students would come and think they were going to be directors and producers, but they weren't. And some of them weren't suited for it at all. One or two, but they would have gone off on their own. One of them became a brilliant cartoonist. One of them became a pilot. It might have been just a jumping ground. But so my answer to you is, I don't think it sits well in universities. In fact, I think the DIT or even Ballymont Senior College, that had more of a feel. You need the combination of both. If you can get it in your own reading and your own form and your way, and maybe in a degree in history or a knowledge of politics, or it doesn't have to be a degree. This is this whole apartheid in education. I cannot stand it, that you have to go to university, that there's something wrong with an apprenticeship. So you will take out all the great stained glass window artists, and we'll take away all the great sculptors, and we'll get rid of all of them because they're not university standard. Far too many people are living in their heads and within the liberal arts, writing shite sociology, that everybody's going, oh, isn't that wonderful? It's rubbish, absolute traumatic rubbish, and not really living in their heads or thinking it through themselves. They're better off to teach a bit of philosophy as opposed to a sociology that has become, you can say anything you want now. And it's a sociological experience. There's a moment there that is all wrong. There's also an apartheid of subjects, that mathematics is the way forward. The universities all capitulated to the banks and they made maths, gave it extra points. This drives me cuckoo, as opposed to music or visual art, which was already a Leaving Certificate subject. So my answer to you is, I think the whole area of apprenticeships and mentoring and craft and skill and bringing back, and if there's one thing COVID has done, it has brought us back to maybe the small and medium-sized artisan makers in Ireland, and find them out. In the Irish Times did, at least Conor, was it Conor Pope? He did a lot of work on all the different Irish companies. They were making everything from toys to chocolates of our skills, our own skills and our own ability. and not living in our heads and then ending up working in a pub. Now, there's nothing wrong with living in your head as long as you don't think it's going to give you the facility to actually go out and smell the street and follow the story and follow the energy, you know. Something about universities that close down energy. They have to be very careful with them. And I'm talking about the liberal arts now. I'm not talking about other areas. And I think they're learning that too. They're becoming... There has to be, and also the people who go into universities have to know how to teach. There's a presumption that somebody who did a PhD or they happen to be an MA should come in and teach the students. What? Like, you have to know how to impart your art, and you have to know how to pull a talent out of somebody, whether you're a good editor or a good publisher or a good friend, or pull it out of somebody. And I think you need teaching, and anybody who's trained to teach great 9-year-olds to imagine can do it with 23-year-olds. There's a presumption. The worst teaching in the world goes on in universities, and nobody wants to talk about it because they're not trained, not properly trained. So my answer to you is mentoring, bit of our skill and training, and a lot of reading around your subject. There's nothing, and you can do that on your own, but there's nothing wrong with form. You learn it one way or the other. And if you can find it, Fergus, take it and bring all your other talents with it, because bring all your passion with it. Bring whatever your passion is with you and get a bit of form, because you need it. You can't flay around in the air. You have to land. Remember John said earlier on that the sub-editors or the editor said to him, oh, there's no article that couldn't be decreased by 400 words, which would be my entire last rant. Could have probably said in two sentences, you know.
John, have you any comment on that, specifically around training and what is there and what isn't there, and how you went about it without any sort of institutional intellectual training, it seems, or am I wrong to say that?
No, you're not. I did do that, but that was kind of the commonplace at the time. I mean, the way that people became journalists then, by and large, but I'm talking about now the early 80s when I started out, I think Rathmines had started up, Rathmines College of Croagh, and they were doing a course, but that was the only course in the country. And that was very novel at the time. But the way into journalism at that time was through the provincial press. You got a job with a local paper as a court reporter or whatever, or just on the, shoe leather reporter, and that's the way you learned. And what actually, then you worked your way up, and if you were good enough, you maybe ended up in a national newspaper. And what was interesting about that, and indeed I think about the way I started by writing for Hot Press, reviewing concerts and albums and doing interviews, then gradually working my way up down the West. I was still working down the West as a mail car driver, and then I came to Dublin and went full time and all that. But at that time, you see, the result of that was that there was a variegation of personality and background in terms of who ended up in journalism. And you ended up, by and large, on the basis of your commitment and your talent, or whatever it would be, right? Whatever you want to call it. Now you kind of make a decision to be a journalist, because it's kind of a high-profile job, and it's a career. And so you go into a college, and you go in there with like-minded people, generally speaking, from the same backgrounds, the same kind of outlook on life. You go to the same tutors. I would love to meet some of Mary Louise's pupils and see if they're out there somewhere. They must be cowering under their desks for fear of all the other woke radicals around them, because they would have to suppress whatever Mary Louise taught them if they're to succeed in the present model of journalism. But you go into the current newspaper now, it's all groupthink. And you see, the groupthink starts in the classroom, it seems to me, obviously, and with the Marxist professor of journalism. And you can see that this in journalism now. I mean, it's quite extraordinary that journalism has now become so many things, but it has essentially become a kind of police force for orthodoxy. It polices certain ideological propositions, and it doesn't do very much else. And the more it kind of goes online, and the more it kind of it becomes, resource-wise challenged in resource terms, the more it becomes like that.
Do you think that's fair, Louise? Can I jump in just to characterize it like that? Would you concur there?
Well, I think he makes a huge point about the people coming from the same background into the classroom, although they do come with different minds and the different mindsets from different areas. I think I was very much my own voice there, and probably didn't get promotion because of it. But I was dealing with radio, and radio I knew about sound, and I knew voice, and I knew pause and inflection and pitch, and I knew because I had learnt it that in radio, unlike print, the less you say sometimes, because your voice is so powerful, that one word, like I always used to give that example where Macbeth says to Lady Macbeth when he's just about to kill the king, and she says, "What if we fail?" And his answer is 2 words: "We fail." Now you can either say with your voice, and it can change the play, "What if we fail?" We fail? What if we fail? We fail. You know, your voice can do is so powerful that radio is a very different medium. And I was looking at it from a dramatic, poetic, lyrical sound, electronic, natural. So I really wasn't in the print journalism. John is that's his whole world, as well as being a great speaker and a good, tremendous voice. But his introduction to journalism would have been on the paper, so I wouldn't.
Yeah. But I think that's
I
interesting.
would agree with that, John. Yeah.
Yeah, I would. I mean, what you described there, Máire Louise, I mean, what you taught clearly is technical skills, which are so important, and understanding of how to communicate. I suppose I'm talking about a different layer of the whole project, which is the ideological level, and that you know, when I started out, you know, it's complicated in the sense that, I mean, most of the journalists I grew up with in the from the 80s on, that I, you know, hung around with and worked with, and I was an editor and who worked for me, were left-leaning journalists, you know. But they were also trained themselves, actually more than anything, in the idea of objectivity. They were interested in getting the other side of the story and in being balanced, and not, you know, it wasn't, every article wasn't to be an onslaught on somebody for some reason. Which is what it seems now articles are, by and large, and that you only want to get one side of the story, or to the extent that you want to get the other side, it's that you want to try to get some ammunition, to some kind of rope to hang the person with that. And that is not what journalism was. And I don't think it is what journalism actually is. So therefore, I believe that what's happening now is not journalism. And you know, you saw that with knobs on here in the last few years, you know, where journalists are basically activists campaigning on certain issues. Now, there's an interesting and subtle distinction here, because there's nothing to stop. I would say that some of the best journalists I ever had come across were people who were highly passionate ideologically or politically. They were definitely committed. They would be socialists of some kinds, or Marxists in some cases, or they would be Republicans, or so, or whatever. Like that passion, it seemed to go with being a journalist. But the point, my job as editor was to say, that's great, and that's wonderful. That's really driving you, and I want you to, you know, follow your star and follow the story. But I want you to make sure you cover the full story. You just don't do one side of it. And that was my job. And you kind of have to deal with people like that. And that isn't happening anymore, because the editors are equally, you know, woke, and they don't know what that is. They don't understand that there is something, you know, about journalism that requires you. It's not a kind of a on the one hand, on the other hand. It's actually that you tell the full story in all its complexity, because every story is complex. So,
but how do you then, because one of the things I found in politics that close people down to, and besides territory closes politicians down to, I mean, it's the territory subsumes the greatest and most creative idea in politics. But how do you then deal with the social media, who is, if you write an opinion that's outside, you know, the herd mind, you know, or the way everybody is thinking, and what, like the Trump thing, if you were to write anything other than he was the greatest evil, the onslaught is just so huge that I think it tempers what people really want to say.
Yeah, it does. It does, for sure. I don't do social media at all. I never have. Well, I did briefly when I ran for election, but somebody else managed I hate it. I think that I've always said, and I for 15, 17 years, I've been saying since Twitter started, I said, that, you know, if there's anybody around to an anthropologist or something to investigate the decline of Western civilization in the 15 years of the 21st century, they will delve into the whole thing, and after many weeks of study and examination and discourse, they will emerge with a piece of paper, and on that piece of paper there will be one word by way of explanation for the collapse of Western civilization, and that word will be Twitter. It is the most appalling creation the world has ever seen. It is anti-civilizational. It is destructive of everything.
Of everything and everybody. That's why when I asked you, how do I find, you know, Substack, you know, how do I find this platform? How do I find, because I don't use social media for this very reason. For this very reason.
Don't use Google. Don't use Google. Use DuckDuckGo. John Waters, Unchained. You'll find it.
John, can you talk to me about, or talk to us and to everyone about Substack and what that represents for you and the effort you try to make with that, not to be writing for the digital audience, even though that's what you're dealing with, or the virtual audience, let's say, but the effort that you make to write in a different way. Yeah,
well, I'm very much of the view that, you know, just conversation is the central piece of democracy. I mean, the vote is not the most important thing about democracy. The vote is only the kind of like the gesture at the end. That is the outcome. But everything that happens before that, the conversation, is the most fundamental thing. And in recent years, we've seen in the world generally, and in Ireland, in a very kind of compressed period, we've seen the destruction of public conversation at a massive, massive rate of knots. I mean, talking about Twitter, I mean, one of the things the reason that I left the Irish Times was that that on Twitter every night, my so-called colleagues were acting like the dogs of war, attacking me for doing my own job. That seemed to be, and nobody seemed to think this was weird or strange or objectionable in any way, that they saw I should suck it up, you know. So I think that, you know, so to me, there was a book came out there, The Shallows. I forget the guy's name, some years ago, about a decade ago, about writing and about reading. And it's essentially about the difference between the page and the screen. And he went through all the different reasons why reading on the screen, reading online, is not the same as reading a book. Now, I'll give you one example, which is out of my own experience. He didn't deal with it in this way, but if you think about it, when we could still go into cafes, you might go in with a magazine, The Spectator, or whatever your preference is, in your pocket or in your handbag. And you get your cup of coffee and you sit down at the window and you lay it out and you come across an article. And you could spend a half an hour or 3/4 of an hour reading that article, sipping your coffee, stopping between paragraphs, looking out the window, thinking it over, looking around you, being inspired to connect something you see on the street with something that's in the article, and reflecting on all this, right? And then you roll up the magazine, you stick it in, off you go out again, right? Now, compared to do that on screen, when you look on screen, in my experience, you're looking essentially to pillage what you're reading for facts. So it's a factoid experience. It's not an experience of enjoyment or pleasure. It's actually, you're saying, what's this saying? What's it saying? And what can I get from it? Maybe if I just read the last paragraph. You're not reading the thing for an experience, you're reading it because there's something frenetic about the relationship between the pixelated screen or whatever it is and the human sensibility. It creates a stress, a tension that actually, now that's complicated by things like hyperlinks. You know, you're reading an article, and I have to say, I do this myself, and I put in hyperlinks in the middle of articles, which is a terrible thing to do because you distract people, you carry them away, and the next thing they're 5 stages away from where they started, and they never finished the article. You know, so I haven't really worked out how to deal with all that stuff yet. So I really believe that. So it seems to me that the page, if you were to actually think of one icon, one symbol, and one very practical at the same time thing, object in culture that is central to our culture, it is the written page, A4 page with writing on it. Our whole civilization has grown out of that concept, of that thing, that icon.
Would you agree that, would you throw in the oral in that, in the sense that
yes, I would.
I'm trying to read the Brothers Karamazov. I find the print very small, but it's been read on the BBC, you know, on Audible. So, and it's a good.
Oh book. Yes.
That
oh, it is. Yeah, and I don't.
Because it's when I hear the voice, I'm there. It's complete conversation. It is just me listening. It's listening. And it is Audible is just outstanding way forward for people who have glasses or who all of that, or who it's outstanding companion of all time.
Okay. Well,
but I agree
what I would say to that is that you write. Yes, I would, because you write differently for a page than you would for a screen, and therefore books are written for pages. Even when they're written on laptops, they're still written for pages, because there is something about that. A good writer intuitively knows how, because you're addressing something through the page, or someone through the page. The page represents either one person or many people, and the screen is like a two-way mirror, because on the other side there are hostile, assassins waiting. You're aware of this in some way, and you pull back. You moderate things, and you write things in a certain convoluted way in order to kind of avoid being attacked. The great thing, the poet, he lost his name. Oh God, it's nothing to do with his lack of fame now. You'll know. He works in Trinity. Brendan Kennedy. He said to me, one of the most beautiful and brilliant things about advice is only about 5 words, I think it is. Best advice to any writer: write as if you were dead. And by that he meant fearlessly. Have no heed of consequences.
I know.
Write everything.
You're right, John. With the screen, you bring insurance policies. You always have a pack of insurance policies there in a little box, so that you just won't tell the total truth.
Yes. But on the other side of that, there's the if you're on social media, there's no vetting. It works both ways. It's because if you write a comment on social media, it's so quick and so easy that you won't hold back, and that you'll give abuse that you wouldn't give to someone if you're writing them a letter, or if you met them on the street. Do you know? So there's two sides to that.
That's more the sense of retaliation. I think that's a different thing.
But you're talking about the art. You're talking about the writing itself. But I'm just saying that.
Okay. Well, let me break it down. I think that what happens on screen and what you described, Fergus, is an engagement through that two-way mirror. What happens on the page in truthfulness is an engagement from your very heart to the world, to the future, to posterity. It isn't about any narrow engagement at that moment. That's at its best, I think. I don't think that it's possible for people to write, you're not going to write a blog today onto a screen that's going to go out 10 seconds after you've finished it, that is going to be remembered or read again in 150 years. I just don't think that's going to happen. And I think it's got to do all these complex reasons, that the page is a different thing completely. Because the page actually, when you see it all in front of you, like when I started writing out first, I wrote in longhand, and then I got a typewriter and learned to type on that. And the typewriter is a very interesting thing, because when you wrote a paragraph or a sentence, the first sentence, you had to know what was going to be in the sentence before you started putting it down. Now you just kind of, on laptop, on the word processor, you kind of just try something out, and you're going to. Now you did a bit of that with the Tipex in the old days, but at the end of the day, if you actually did that with the typewriter, you would have a page of Tipex and nothing else on it. So I think that there's something we've lost, and we've lost the understanding of these things. It's like there's all kinds of things. Writing is more than just the conveyance of information. It's all kinds of things. It's subtext and it's intimation and hinting and double entendre in language and puns that have sort of resonances. People don't write like that online, in my experience, or far online. You might read a piece online that comes from that sensibility, but you don't read. They don't, because they're not thinking. They're thinking about making a point. Yes. It's like a boxing match or something. And this is like an entirely different. It's because you're actually writing for an instant audience, essentially, and that audience is waiting for you. So when I write, what I try to do it with my thing, even though it is online, I try to write as if I'm writing for a newspaper or a magazine or a book, so that it's a different sensibility, I believe. And, it has, I would like people.
The social media is no reflection. It's either an attack or an agreement, and it never tells you why.
Yes.
Yeah, it has no reflection. It has no moment of what's not said either. It's just an attack. It's a basic.
And both are imposters, really, because there's no content in the thing. It seems to me, it seems to me to be valueless, the whole thing. I honestly don't see any benefit to Twitter. Honestly, I think it's just.
Did you ever read Niall Postman's book, the book he wrote before he died, called Technopoly?
I didn't read that one. I read the Amusing Ourselves to Death was.
Yeah, and the Disappearance of Childhood. No, but Technopoly he wrote just before he died very quickly. And we died very young, rather, and he died he wasn't unwell. He just died very quickly, but which we're allowed to say. He wrote a book called Technopoly. I think you should get that, John. You would, where he took on the whole internet, the resurgence of the internet. And it's quite brilliant. And what he has said 15 years ago has completely come to pass. You'd love that book, Technopoly. It's a lovely word too.
Thank you. I will. I love Amusing to Ourselves to Death. It was a wonderful book when it came out. It's over 30 years ago now. Yeah. But I think that's something. That's what. So Substack. I don't know what Substack means. I mean, so I kind of sometimes give it so because people have tried John Waters. I don't know what it means, but.
Well, subscriber and then stack of papers. It seems to be just a bit of a compound word.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Maybe. I would have thought about a million better words for it off the top of my head, But anyway, that's what it is. And so it's very good. I mean, it's a completely open platform so far. There's no question of any interference or censorship or anything like that. You can say it's your page. As far as I know, nobody officially looks at it or moderates it or anything like that. And you're free to do it. You can put up as much stuff as you like. You can put up articles, videos. You could even put up a book if you wanted, I'm sure. You can do poems. You can do whatever you like, and you can monetize if you want as well. I haven't, but maybe one day if I feel like it, I will. I don't know. It's something that some people do. Like they'll just allow people to donate a price of a cup of coffee or something like that, which is apropos of what I was saying, the coffee and, I do think though that we've lost something with the loss of the page, the piece of paper. I always say to people, that if we'd lived through the age of electronic screens and reading, and we'd never heard of newspapers, and then somebody one day invented this crinkly thing, which had all this writing on it, and you could roll it up and put it in your pocket, we would think it was the greatest invention of all time. This is like, in other words, I think that in a certain sense, chronologically, the newspaper is out of place. It should come after all this nonsense. It should be, because actually we will need to restore the newspaper, in my opinion, if we are to restore our civilization. I really do believe that.
Louise, let me ask you about the output on the screen, on the television screen in Ireland of late. not the laptop or the phone. And you used the word epic earlier to describe what will be on RTE on New Year's Eve. So are you waiting on the edge of your seat for that?
No, I'm not. I think our RTE has. I think it's in real trouble. I think the TV is in real trouble, serious trouble. It's not creating, it's copying, and criticizing, but it's not creating. And I know it's in real trouble when it's selling land to buy houses. I know the national broadcaster is in trouble. Now that's financial trouble, but that's creative trouble as well. That's serious, serious trouble that nobody really wants to save it. We're back to the Catholic Church. The output is appalling. The voices are appalling. The lack of imagination in programming it's all the worst form of copying from the British stations and not creating our own. I mean, we're going to have a program on New Year's Eve, and it's going to be, I don't know what it's going to be, but we're going to be interviewing a boy band, because what else would you do? And it's going to be epic. And I thought, Jesus, the language, even the lack, even in our reading of the news, the lack of intonation, the bad inflection, what word, we don't know what we're being told, because we're not putting oral sense on what has been written. And everybody has forgotten that television is an oral medium. Use your voice as well as you see the perfect figure, the perfect hair, the perfect dress, the perfect trousers, whatever. You hear people speaking, and as continuity announcers, or as informative announcers, or as newsreaders, or as interviewers, or as reporters. What are you talking about? I mean, I'm literally saying that onto the screen. I am watching newscasters who cannot speak, who cannot pronounce their words, and it's not that they're not lovely people. They're just not being trained to do it. What are they talking about? What are the reporters told? How are the reporters repeating what the newscasters are saying? Why has our news got no energy? Why am I not saying this is energetic and alive and I'm going to learn something? Why am I sitting there going, any minute now I'm going to click over to Judge Judy? Do you know, because I lock into it for the news. Why are people getting in the way of the news? Why am I watching people standing with their hands in their pockets, being casual, trying to be formal, casual, formal? Why are people getting in the way of the information? Is there something going on? And it's all a kind of a dumbing down or something. And everybody, no matter, you don't really know anything, but I'm just out here and I'm going to find out about it because I've nothing else to do.
What do you mean by that? What kind of?
I just find that there's
that example that you had. Like, I honestly just don't watch TV in Ireland because I'm not there. But what do you mean, like the fellow with his hand? I know it's a metaphor, but
why on
what kind of show? What kind of?
Like, we say prime time now. Prime time. Why are people standing with their hands in their pockets? What's that about? Why are people standing with clipboards like this? Why aren't they serious and talking to us? Why are they getting in the way? Those kind of things get in the way of communication. And this is the technique I was talking about earlier on radio. It's a technique. You know, if you are going to be, you have to be formal, casual, formal. This is a serious gig, you know, and this casual kind of, tell us about now, what did you think? And did you not feel all that kind of high-pitched, untrained vocality? Maybe it's me. It's probably me. And they're saying, that old hag a bear there, you know, from the Jurassic Park era, doesn't know what she's talking about. Well, I'm sorry, I do. Because I do look at other programs on other stations, and they have personality and formality, and personality and formality. There's a difference between, you know, you're not in a restaurant and it's not casual. It is a formal public station and we pay money for it. And I have expectations of standard.
So where is it done well?
Pardon?
Where is it done well?
Well, music, it does well in music, and it had some very good programs of music in situations around Ireland. You know, different young musicians playing, and there was some young singers, and it was situated in different parts of Ireland. It was beautifully filmed and nicely done, and some of our natural history programs, our nature programs. But generally speaking, we are very bad at comedy, and we think it's interesting that the most watched program was The Greatest Showman, Coronation Street, EastEnders? Why wasn't one of the greatest watch programs over Christmas something we'd created ourselves? We have to stop copying and criticizing and create. And I would say, and it's not that the people in RT are not good and fine and wonderful. It just need a little bit more direction. It seems to be a bit directionless at the moment, the television. I don't know what John thinks about it. Maybe he doesn't watch television, but I do, because I'm interested in what's being said. Why aren't we having proper discussion programs? Exactly what he's saying, separate or whatever. Why are RT always interviewing each other? Why don't they find new voices and new faces? One of the best programs actually on television is The Repair Shop, and the other one is Nationwide was good because it was inspirational about people who were doing different things and creating different things, from tidy towns to the chocolate here. I mean, there was something going on there, but that's really it. I can't point, we copy badly. I mean, it's a rant on it. I mean, it's a public station and I'm paying money for it, and it's also getting money for its ads, and it's also getting sponsorship for its presenters. So it needs to clean up, my opinion.
John, what do you make of all of that?
Well, you said, Fergus, that you don't watch Irish television because you're not there, and I don't watch Irish television because I'm here. I avoid it like I avoid COVID if it exists. And I think Máire Louise has given a very excellent sort of granular analysis of the thing, you know, in a few broad strokes of how the thing plays out in front of your eyes. I think that the kind of key to understanding what lies beneath this is if you do a comparison. When I watched TV probably up to about 5 years ago, and even then it was well gone, and I believe it's much worse. And anytime I kind of am in the room where the television set on now, I'm confirmed in my belief that it's much worse, right, within a very short time, and I have to leave that room pretty quickly. But if you go back to the early days of television in Ireland, and I mean, we didn't have a television for years, but I used to see it in other people's houses, and then for years, and when we did have a TV, like there was a certain kind of somber tone to the whole thing. You know, it was like a serious business, as Máire Louise says. It seemed to take itself and its function in society deeply seriously, and it seemed to extend to its audience a belief that they were intelligent and that they were worthy of respect. Now, anything I saw in recent years, I don't get that. There's a playing down to people as if that they're seeking some lowest common denominator, which actually doesn't even exist. But they try to get everybody in. And I think the consequence of this is that almost everybody is watching stuff that's beneath them, but they can't help themselves because there's no alternative. And they just sit watching it and grazing it. And it's having an organic that's having an organic effect on people, because you can actually see it now in the way people are and the way people talk and the way people think. You see, one of the things that I keep saying about the modern world is that there's an aspect of it which we don't think about because we don't think. And the reason we don't think is because of this aspect. And that mass television, mass media 24/7. Like when the great books about propaganda were written in the early decades of the last century by Jackie Lowell and Bernays and Vance Packard and these guys, you know, they were warning about all these things, these dangers of mind control and hypnosis and entrancement and all these things. Now, at that time, they were dealing purely with print and a little bit of radio. You know, think of what they would have to say now if they came here and started looking around them and say, what the hell? Because the thing about media now, it's not what it actually tells us, what it is doing to us in a certain sense, what it is giving us, what we are receiving from it. It's actually all the things that are not happening in our minds because it is going all the time and it is cramming our heads full of nonsense. And as a result, we are speaking back nonsense and we're repeating things. I think that actually, to go back to the educational thing, I would say that the big problem with education in general now is that it actually, I mean, I think as Peter Hitchens said, that it doesn't teach people how to think, it teaches people what to think. And that's kind of what television is doing now as well. That it's giving people slogans to mouth to each other, lines to you know, understandings of psychology, which are at the most rudimentary level, you know, in the form of soap opera. soap opera sandwiched between news bulletins, which turned the news bulletins into soap opera also.
Correct.
All this, is actually new. And because there is no higher court of media to look down on this, nobody knows that it's happening unless you're actually acutely aware, as I've had to become through my own experiences and my job and all the rest of it, and watching and trying to figure out, why did this happen? Like, how come I can't work in the media anymore? What's that about? Why is it, and so I think, but now here's a new development, which is that this is going to be really, I think, seismic. And if we have a culture left to make anything seismic after this shit show, it is that the broadcasting charge is to be introduced. Now, the broadcasting charge is actually not going to be a TV license in the old style, which is that you have to have a set. It's going to be a charge per household. And I remember actually talking to Pat Rabbitte when he was Minister for Telecommunications and trying to tease this out to get to the logic of how you can actually charge people for something which they do not use, or which they actually might regard as harmful to their lives and their children's lives. How can you do that? He says, well, his answer was, well, in a democracy, broadcasting is an essential element, and it furthers, the democratic discourse, and therefore everybody has a stake in that, and therefore everybody should pay for it. But I said, but what if you actually think it's damaging your country, damaging your culture, damaging your society, damaging you? What then? Do you not have a right to say, no, I'm not paying for that? I don't have a television. I don't want a television. I've never been near it. I haven't been near a television for years. I won't be going near one. Please, you can take my word for it. Here, put the handcuffs on me now, because that's what I'll be doing, for sure. There's no earthly way I will pay for that. What's going on now? Do you think
we could have a bit of a repeat? Máire Louise, I remember, actually, this is funny. I was with you in transition here during the water stuff.
Yes.
The water charges, and it was the autumn of 2014. I don't want to get that wrong now. Maybe I'll get the dates wrong. Anyway, around that time, and the phrase was, no way we won't pay. And there were 100,000 people marching in the street, and the government balked. Capitulated. And I remember you were quite critical of that capitulation. Do you think something similar might happen now?
Oh, yes, I can tell you. I'll be the first. I'm not paying a broadcasting charge. I'm not paying RTE. I'm not paying the license in April. I'm so angry with the behavior, the program. There's no way I'm paying for it. I'll give them maybe €34 because everything else has been a repeat. I'm watching Daniel O'Donnell, and there's nothing wrong with Daniel O'Donnell. He's a wonderful singer from Donegal, but I do not want to see him every Saturday night for the last 6 years. So that's an example of the repetition I'm talking about. Repetition. No creation. If you create dramas, if you create some cultural programs, if you have some discussion programs, preferably a few cultural discussions, maybe about the arts in Ireland, not just the one-to-one interview with writers who we know very well, just about other people's minds, other cultural minds, other different minds. Could we have them? Could we have some discussions? Could we have some discussions on religion? Which, to be fair to Vincent Browne, bring back Vincent Browne, because at one time on TV3, on Virgin Media rather, he had religious discussions in the evening. I mean, there was some mind involved in it. There's no sense. It's a repetition of a repetition, and it's all these stars, people who've become stars overnight. I am not paying for their stardom, especially when I know it's talentless and boring and vocally unmelodic and inept. Now, I don't want to go any further.
But it could be that they are afraid.
Television.
We've spoken a number of times. The two of you have talked about the herd mind and all of that. Could it be that if you put Ryan Tubridy in the chair of Gay Byrne 30 years ago, he would show that same? I know it's just an example, for argument's sake. Could it be that the person in that chair would manifest the same integrity because they were allowed to, where maybe now you're straitjacketed in an organization like that because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing and getting sued and being attacked on Twitter and all the rest. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, I do. John has said it. John has said it. Like what RTE should be doing, and I use the word again, is elevating. Not all of it, but elevate 40% of your outcome. You know, like, stop capitulating to noise. You stop capitulating to the lowest common denominator. Stop it. You know, because there are many of us who would, and there is a place for all aspects of culture and all aspects of discussion and all aspects of life in a national broadcaster. But there is no sense of differentiation to the intelligence of the people who are looking and watching, and their capacity for knowledge and their capacity to live and to want to live, you know, in an inspiring world and an inspired world. And you see, there are examples in other jurisdictions of great programming, you know, and great dramas and great discussions and great comedy. I don't want to sound like teacher. I'm not talking about that at all. Entertainment is when you go to a good play, you don't have to have read thousands of plays to have an impact of a great play and great actors bringing you somewhere. There's no impact. It has no impact, and we are paying a lot of money for it. So anyway, I get very annoyed about it, Fergus, because I think it lacks standard. It seriously lacks form and standard. And I wouldn't be the only one saying this. And I wouldn't be a lot of people who actually work in it who are directionals and who know it and who know and have a lot more to offer, or we're closed down or let go.
Well, yeah. Would this be, or John, you have something to say?
Well, just to address your question there about Gay Byrne and the present situation, I think there's something in that, but it is kind of like the chicken and egg thing, you know, that what's actually going on now is that RTE is generating the society and the society is regenerating RTE or not, or the opposite, whatever the opposite of regeneration is, because it's getting its own, you know, like effluent back and is recycling it. That's kind of like the tone and the approach and what is permissible and what is acceptable. I mean, Gay Byrne was a fantastic broadcaster because he had, above anything, a profound, curiosity about the person in front of him. He was extraordinary in that he actually really listened to you and he wanted to know why you thought what you think and to communicate this to others. And in the broadcasting and radio, I mean, I remember many times when I was out in the mornings driving, working, when I was a young man, pulling into the side of the road lest I miss a word of the exchange that was happening. You know, like now it's just noise in the background if it is there, I'm sure, for people. As regards your question about the water charges, I'm interested in that. I actually don't think, now, first of all, I would say, I mean, I think I possibly disagree with Máire Louise about this, in that I would have favored, I would be in favor. The original water charge thing was a genuine popular protest. And really the basis of it was, you've come for everything. You've dipped every single pocket we have in my trousers and in my jacket. You're not getting this.
That's right.
That was the thing, right? Now, the whole thing was hijacked by the left, by the far left, and that became ugly. And I lost interest in it then. But I think the fact that there was that awakening then at that time, I think you're right, approximately, Ferguson, the time. It's about 6 years ago. It's about the beginning of the real, that's the moment of rupture I'm talking, sometime around then, maybe just before that. But I don't know if the mindset is there now. I think we've been so worn down, and particularly this year, broken, that actually they will get away with it. And I don't know where precisely, I didn't quite follow Máire Louise's thread in the previous interview I saw, but it seems to me, I do agree, I think, that actually the issue here is not whether or not we pay for water as a principle. The issue here is whether we can preserve and retain the ownership of our own water into the future, and that ought to be done by way of constitutional referendum. But it seems to me that what's really going on is that certain elements within the political class have done deals already in which that resource will be traded off, as everything else is being traded off now in the current.
Well, I'd have to come back on you there because I was with Eamon Ryan at the time, and about that, because that was my big worry. I didn't that the privatization of water would become the big issue, and I encouraged the government to put it in the constitution that on no time could our water ever be sold. And I said, and the people will preserve what is theirs. But if they think for a moment it's going to be hived off to some company like everything else has, they don't believe you unless you put it. And we tried to get it into legislation and get it ring fenced. And then you got a ring fenced that 80% of the Dáil and 90% of the Senate had to agree to privatize it, which would never happen. But still the public didn't agree with that because they had been, as you say, duped before. So you were right on that. Yeah. And I think that we need to preserve it, and it needs to be in the constitution, and it will be hijacked by 1,000 others if we don't do that. You're completely right. But the government wouldn't do it. They just wouldn't do it. And I said, but it is our breath of life. You know, we should do it. It's the one thing we should put in the constitution. And no, wouldn't do it. So, but I'm not too sure that they have sold it or done deals. I don't think so, John.
I'm afraid because 20 odd years ago, I remember writing in the Irish Times that water would be the oil of the 21st century.
Yes, and you're right.
And we have it. We have it.
We have it in spades here.
Yeah. So, and particularly down the west, there's no end of it. This is another thing that people down the west particularly couldn't stomach. This stuff is falling by the bucketful every minute. And they want to charge me for it. Come on.
That's absolutely ridiculous. But you see, if the government had even used the word preservation, if they had used the word, nationalize, preserve, they didn't even use any of those words. It was just a tax.
But let me ask you something, Marie-Louise. Isn't this the point that unifies that issue with the COVID thing? That actually there is no capacity now for leadership in the sense of being able to invoke, confidence and, solidarity. I mean, can you imagine a great leader saying to people last March and saying, look, we're in a bit of trouble. We have a virus coming. It could be bad. It mightn't be so bad. We don't know. I want you to really, for yourselves and your families and for all of your fellows, I want you to kind of do a few things. Do you think
what you're asking there, listen, John, what you're asking there is, yes, you're completely right. And there were leaders like Leo would say he did that. Micheál Martin would say he did that. Simon Harris would say he did that. However, what you're actually saying there is that you need somebody to say that we actually believe in. That that we actually believe in and say, okay, all right.
But Marie-Louise, look what had just happened. We voted all these guys out of power. We wanted shot of them. And suddenly they were expecting that we would do what they asked us to do. Come off it. We wanted shot of them. You look at the outcome of the election. The election, as the one before it, said one thing clearly. A plague on all your houses.
Your houses, yes.
Yeah, a plague on all your houses. So in a sense, what actually happened here, you could say was that due to their inability to lead, they had no choice but to coerce. Now that's a fairly staggering judgment on the political class.
Well, and they had the enemy at the gate. They had the enemy at the gate called Sinn Féin, or they would see it. They had a big enemy at the gate.
Yes, well, they're about the same. I don't see.
No, but all right, we won't call it an enemy, but they had a serious opponent at the gate. Yes. We won't call them an enemy, but they had a serious opponent at the gate. So what were they going to do? Who had swept up all the Fine Gael votes, up all those votes over the last 15 years, swept them out of power. Yes. They did it themselves, of course, but then they swept it all up. Up, disadvantaged area, working class areas, lower middle class areas, swept it all up. Yes. So you're right. So what do we do here? We have to come together because that's our real opposition, not each other.
Well, you see, I mean, Fergus earlier there was reading out from my book, Jiving at the Crossroads, which was written 30 years ago. And now I actually have to really question myself as to how I feel about that book, because either it's a book about an Ireland that is long gone, or it's a book which is absolutely unreal in terms of its descriptions of this country. And I'm not sure exactly which of those, if either of those is totally true, or which of them is the more true. So I have to kind of reevaluate. And I did reevaluate there a few years ago when it was reissued, and I wrote an afterword which kind of tried to do a little bit of that. But you see, I think something, this idea of this moment of rupture, something radical has happened in our country in the probably relatively recent past, where we crossed over some line and nobody really noticed at the time. But from then on, things began to change in a radical way. And it's not like the kind of shift that happens in society, which happens organically from within, where you can see maybe that something is moving towards some kind of corruption or moving towards some kind of, totalitarianism or something like that. It's like it came to us almost entirely from outside influences, that forces that we had attracted here by virtue of our tax rates or whatever it would be, started to dictate to us and demand from our leaders certain things. And as a result, that the country began to be changed without the consent of its people, by and large, except tokenistically. And I think that that's
give me an example of who demanded that change, who came in under the door with tax-wise with that change.
I'm thinking in particular of the corporates, the big tech companies, the big pharma. Big pharma, I mean, the big pharma are a big force in this whole present thing, have no doubt about it. And that we are entirely dependent. I mean, something phenomenal out of our GDP is chemicals, even though I don't think there's an Irishman alive who ever made a tablet in his life, wouldn't know what to do with it except swallow it. This is the bizarre absurdity that we have in our culture now and economically. And it seems to me that our political leadership is now so radically compromised by these circumstances that our country is not safe in their hands. And that therefore that's why I say that book, Jiving at the Crossroads, I mean, I would almost have it banned now, because it portrays a version, a very kind, I suppose, compassionate and complex version of the Irish politician, which might be dangerous now to the next generation if they were to believe it. Because I think that actually something deeply sinister is going on and we need to wake up to it.
And when you say, and what do you see as the outcome of that sinister element? What do you?
I see that under various headings and under different kind of understandings of what I'm about to say, is that our country is being sold, our freedoms are being sold, our land is being sold from under us. Our values are being sold. Our culture is being sold. There is no value on it. The Irish person no longer is regarded as having some sacred right to speak in his own land. And I think that's a big, 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 big moment. And we can feel it all the time now. They're bringing in hate speech laws now to stop us even speaking about things, even asking questions now will be a hate issue. This is unbelievable in terms of, for somebody like me who grew up in this country, having the free flow of discussion all the time. That was what made this country such a beautiful place. I've often said it, that, when I was going around with my father as a young fella, in the van, I mean, sometimes if he had the flu, God help us, he'd be arrested now for having the flu, but he used to have the flu. It wasn't a criminal. And he would ask me to come. Well, he'd wake me up in the morning when he was going out. Say, will you come? I'm not feeling great. So I'd sit up and I'd bring out the mails and all that. And you go into the post office like at 6 o'clock in the morning, like there'd be 7 or 8 fellas there sorting letters and postmen getting their bags ready. And the free flow of engagement would leave you intoxicated for hours with the joy and the humor of it. That's been extinguished in our culture by all of this stuff that's been going on. It's if you look around you now, and Louise and Fergus, I mean, I find this now, and it's something I check out with people that I grew up with when I talk to them, that if I said, do you find that when you talk to people now about certain things, they start looking around them, before they answer? And then the most they'll say is, sure, you can't open your mouth. This is new in our culture. This never happened before.
Yes, well,
and this is as a result of all of these forces.
These
forces in concert, the corporatocracy, the corrupted media, all of these forces, the social media, the bullying, all of these kind of forces which have taken to the streets in order to stop people having thoughts in public, expressing thoughts in public in any way. This is a very sinister, this is the way, we're not allowed to make any comparisons with past horrors in Germany and other places. But I think sometimes you have to make them because they are opposite. Because very often, I think you look, and if you read into what happened in Germany in the 30s, you see signs of it happening now in other countries, including Ireland. And I think that we need to wake up. There's so much demonization of people going on. There's so much lying about people going on. There's so much spinning going on. There's so many bots out there on Twitter and on Facebook and all over the place telling lies on an industrial basis, night, noon, and morning, about good people who are simply trying to speak the truth as they understand it. It mightn't be what you believe to be true, or what Fergus believes to be true, or what I believe to be true, but to the best of their ability, they have tried to find out what is true, and they're entitled to say it, or they used to be. Now they're not. And what happens? The journalism, the profession that I used to belong to, that proudly I belong to, that I longed for many years to belong to, acts to silence them, to bully them, to demonize them, to lie about them. That's all. That's what we've come to in our so-called civilization. I think we're in the deepest trouble. I can't believe I'm saying these things. I can't believe I've grown to the age I've grown to, and that this has happened in my country. Because I used to read people like Orwell and Huxley and these guys and think, those guys are for the birds, they must be on some wacky backy, to be imagining these things, So
my
God,
what's going to happen in Ireland?
Would that living at this hour? What?
Sorry, yeah. Just what's going to happen in Ireland what's going to happen with the vaccine? Do you think, like, will you have to take it to get on a bus and to go to school and to do all that? Have any kind of predictions on how that'll be rolled out and what level of obligation there will be on people to take it?
Well, I mean, this is the extraordinary thing. This is the kind of thing that's happening now, where they say, oh no, it's not going to be mandatory, but you won't be able to live unless you get it. In other words, you won't be able to go into a shop and buy a loaf of bread. You won't be able to go to a theatre. You won't be able to, go on a holiday abroad.
Is that
won't be able to cross
the case? Is that in the pipeline?
That's what the health czars apparently are telling us. That this is their what they're actually saying. What they're saying precisely. I've heard a couple of quotes. They say, "Oh no, it's not going to be mandatory. People just won't be able to go and do things." That's up to them. You'll have
a vaccine passport.
That's right.
Something like that. It'll be like a vaccine passport.
But But the point is, you see here that we used to have a constitution that would make you laugh off statements like that. But now the constitution in this whole episode has been reduced to a roll of toilet paper, and it will remain a roll of toilet paper until some person with a wig or without a wig, calling him or herself a judge, has got finds about his person or her person somewhere the courage to sit on a bench and declare this thing unconstitutional from top.
John, can I ask you something, Fergus, if this is all right? When you stood for politics in the last election, what did you find out about the Irish people? Did they disappoint you in getting, when you got to know them, when you were going around and talking to them, or did they disappoint you in what they said and what they did in relation to the vote? Did they disappoint you in their attitudes? Did they listen to what you were saying? Did they hear you? I'd be very interested in what you had to say about that.
I would say that actually it's very interesting. It's a very interesting. I didn't particularly want to run it, but I was persuaded to run it. I wasn't in the best of health, and I didn't really do that much canvassing. But I'll tell you, I mean, what I found, even in the short time, was something that really bore out what I had seen in the Trump situation in America. I don't mean in relation to me now, but in the context of that divide, that actually the world does now divide into two. And it divides cleanly in a way that I think it does replicate that sense of, I call them the concrete classes, or you could call them, I think the Greeks used to call them the able classes, the able men. They're the people who work, the people of muscle, people, not necessarily just men, but also women who worked with their hands, who worked in shops or who did cleaning work or all kinds of work, what used to be called manual labor. And then what I call the tippy tappy brigade, which is working now in the virtual world. And I would say that's kind of that there's a kind of a rock solid sense you get from working people that you don't any longer get from people who are supposedly educated by and
We're
large.
living in their heads, yeah.
Yes, and I think the reason for that is that, you know, we don't really think about this. You know, I mean, when I was a kid, when I was going to school, I went to a secondary school. The kind of idea of the tech was kind of just beginning to lose traction. And not, if you went to the tech at that point, you were regarded as a bit of a dullard, you know. And so you had to go to the secondary school. But I think that there's something lost there, because, you know, our fathers who could make things and fix things had a great wisdom, which actually arose precisely out of their understanding of the world, developed in learning those skills and how the world fitted together, so that they could extrapolate from that sense in relation to politics or the law or just theological issues or algebra or whatever it would be. I remember my father, even as old as I am now, was still able to do algebra from primary, having left school at 11. He could do leave-insert problems in his head. When I would be floundering, you know, like, so what I'm saying is that there's an intelligence that is, because, you know, if you actually think about it, if you watch a little child, let's say a 2-year-old child playing with stuff, and watch the way he or she puts together, you know, a load of bricks on the back of a tractor, a toy tractor or something like that, and loads them up carefully. And touches everything and feels everything and sniffs things and uses the senses to explore how the world is fitting together. You see, that's kind of the way up to very recently, everybody found out how the world worked, what the world was. But then we started, I mean, again, it's a bit kind of against my point earlier about the page and the book, and it's more to your point about the oral culture, Máire Louise. But that, you know, at a certain point, it became abstracted because it was all second-hand knowledge that we're receiving, and that there was a cut-off of that learning through touch and the senses. And I think that's a very real problem now in the culture, where there's a lot of people, and again, you see this, I think, from what people tell me about Twitter, that there's a kind of a remoteness, a detachment, dissociation about so much thinking that you get there, that people have abstracted thoughts that have no basis in actual living reality. And so I think that, you know,
go back to the politics. Go back to when you were standing. Was that something that you saw, that divide?
Oh, yeah, I did. I feel that very strongly now, and I encountered that. I mean, I ran in Dundee, which is a almost suicidal thing to do for someone like me, you know, because it's the most progressive so-called constituency in the country. But I got enough, as somebody pointed out to me, I got about 850 votes, which they said, like, that's a decent sized village in Mayo. And he said, if you could find that village, you'd be a great man, you know. You could be the chieftain down there, you know, and you know, you never look back. And I'm still looking for it, you know. Anytime I go down and have a look and I count people, you know. Yes, I think it was an experimental thing to do. It was a kind of a gesture. I wanted to say, this is important now. There's a moment that is important. I didn't understand what was about to happen, but I have had a feeling for the last few years that we're in the deepest trouble. And I wanted to at least say, I did this. So I worry about people now in the sense that I don't think they're engaged anymore. I mean, politics, when we were growing up, politics was literally...
Politics has... Yes, it has undermined itself to the point where people are not ashamed by it, but they're semi-shamed by it. They don't want to be involved in it because it expresses such weakness, capitulates too often. It doesn't stand up, you know, and that's the thing about the church we were earlier on. But I think if I was giving you, I think you'd make a terrific senator. You should think about the Senate in the next election. It's exactly where you should be as a thinker and a speaker. And you in the Senate, it is exactly the place for you because you are a philosopher and a lyrical philosopher and a thinker and a reader. That's where you should be. That's the kind of minds we need. Your kind of mind in the Senate, because the Senate has great power, different kind of power, better power.
Did you not find it a frustrating experience?
I did, but I have found most situations in my life full of frustration. That was no shagging different, you know, being in the Senate. I found the whole area of territory awful. You know, they weren't able to make a national argument. They couldn't see the arts as national. It had to be territorial. They hadn't the generosity. You know, if there's one word, of course, it's greed across the screen. You've one word, Twitter. I have greed and territory. But I did find it. Are we gone?
No, I think we're good. I think we're good.
I did find it, there was a freedom in it because you weren't answering, at least I wasn't answering a constituency, and neither would you be. Some politicians, some senators were because they wanted to get into the Dáil, you know, and they were kind of yo-yoing between the two. But there was a few minds there now that were good. And it was, I think that's what you should think about, and you should stand for the Senate.
Well, I don't know where I'd stand because, you know, it's extraordinarily difficult to get elected to the Seanad. I mean,
you get a nomination. You get a nomination from the Taoiseach, from Leo. You ask Leo Varadkar.
Do you think they'd want John, Máire-Louise? Do you think he'd manage?
That boat has sailed a long time since, Máire-Louise. I'm doomed.
Oh, you never know. Politics is the art of coming around again, you know? Here we go again, you know? It's never, you're never finished in politics.
Oh,
never.
Man, I don't know. I think I've done the best I can now to finish myself.
Yeah, well, of course, the university, no, you wouldn't get the university, but you get a panel. You get on a panel. You should think about it. You'd be an excellent senator. That's my opinion of that. Because
don't hold your breath now, Máire-Louise, because you might expire in the waiting.
Let's
how long does this conversation go on, Fergus? Before the people start going to bed with the cups of tea.
If you have to go to bed, I can't stop you. But the audience has maintained
at 3 o'clock in the morning.
But seriously, the audience online, I've been intermittently checking it, and it's actually grown very, very slightly. It's not like it's only people aren't disappearing, you know. People are really enjoying this, and
that's good.
Just to make the point, I think the value is in the detail and in the substance. But yes, go on, show us. I
wanted to show us. Can you show that photograph, John? Can you see that photograph, which was the people in a community burying a friend in the middle of the flood?
Yes.
They had the coffee. Can you see it, John? He's gone again.
I can, yeah, in the back of the truck.
Yeah, I thought it said everything about the community and acknowledgement of death amidst the rain. What you were talking about earlier on. So I think it's one of the most beautiful photographs.
That's the thing.
Exactly what you were talking about, John, earlier on.
Yeah. And
anyway, it just came to mind there.
So we might get ourselves as far as even the community, in my experience, resisted death as a concept because it has to understand that death is part of life. I mean, however much I may rail against the prospect of my own death or about the death of a loved one or anything like that. So this is the first time I've ever seen communities actually arrogating to themselves the capacity to avoid death, to actually annul death, to cancel death, or to postpone death, or to, push death away. It's not possible. And this is a terrible.
But those that happened to are completely and entirely traumatized by it. And it were made. It became a rule. They couldn't go to the funeral. They couldn't bury the people. They couldn't hold their hands. It's just.
It's unforgivable to me, Máire-Louise.
It is unforgivable.
I think but it's barbaric. I mean, I don't understand. I don't know how the people who are responsible for such a decision can think they can walk down the streets again of this country, as if nothing had happened. I will certainly be walking up to them and telling them it's what I think of them. Sure, because I'm involved in taking action, I've got a lot of abuse people who have been, of course, prime propaganda. But I intend to debate in spades when this is all over and forget all this. I will be what I think and what I remember. I'll be an old fella by then. I'll be terrible things.
Mary Louise, can you hear? Can you hear John? Because it might be my connection is unstable.
He's kind of fading in and out there. Maybe he needs to just. He's just fading in just for a few minutes.
That's terrible, because that was the best thing I said.
No, but they're just John. I don't know. John, there might be people using the internet.
I say it might be. Would it be censorship? Would it be the moguls? I'll say it again. What I'm saying is, that maybe people picked it up.
There's somebody using a mobile.
That good people have had to do this. Have had to be buried in this way. That their loved ones have had to stay away. I mean, apparently now 10 people is all you're allowed to go to a funeral with, Like, who does it think you are? Like, who are people to be? Máire Hendley, is it like that? Is everybody to be a Máire Hendley, where they will have the undertaker and a priest and maybe the 2 pallbearer or 4 pallbearers? That leaves 4.
Well, now this is that's a bit of a crass comparison. Now, I mean, come on, Máire Hendley.
But it's not crass. No, because they're being criminalized. People are being you see, at the very heart of this, Máire.
Well, the government would say they're being protected.
Very fundamental. Oh, to hell with the government. To hell with the government.
They're the ones who made the ones who are making the rules. I'm only giving you an argument.
I know they are
making the rules. They're making the rules.
I know who they are, Marie. I know.
There isn't an Irish person. There isn't an Irish person I know that would marry their loved one.
We should not stand for it. We should not.
That's a different argument.
No, it's not. What they have done to people with this whole thing is they have criminalized something which is fundamental to the human structure, which is that we become sick, we become infectious, we pass it on, others get it. And that process strengthens most of us for most of the time, for most of our lives. At the end, that process lets us down because life is ebbing, is running out. And that's the natural order of things. To say that you can interfere with that, and in the course of interfering with it, you brutalize good, decent people and treat them as if they were criminals because they have become ill, because they have become infectious. This is an outrage beyond description. We should not stand for it. We should march on their houses, on their buildings of power, and demand that they leave, clear their desks and go to hell out of our sight. They are unfit to lead this country or any country. They are unfit for human company. They are a disgrace to the human race, all of them. I want to see none of them again. That's what I was saying. If I see one of these people again in my life, I will do to them what was done to me for the last 9 months in the streets of Dublin, being shouted at by men in lycra on bicycles and the like. I will tell them what I think of them. They are shameful people, shameful. They have no morals of any kind, it seems to me. And the idea that they're doing this to protect people's health and protect people's life is an obscenity beyond words.
I want to come in here and incite, because the two of you have a mutual enjoyment and admiration and familiarity with Patrick Kavanagh. And Máire Louise, if you don't mind, could you bring him right now with some of his work? And just to also make the observation, and maybe John, you might have a little 2 cents on this, but earlier Máire Louise was lamenting the way that Raglan Road is performed usually in song, and the kind of hackney or the I don't know, the hatchet the hatchet that is taken to it. And I never really thought about it. I've always enjoyed Luke Kelly's rendition, but I'm not a wordsmith like her. But yeah,
I like Luke Kelly's rendition. I mean, it's an extraordinary lyric. I mean, if you actually think of the Raglan Road as a lyric, there's certainly no song which has a popular song that has a better lyric than that song. I think, if it is a song, it's a poem. It's a fantastic poem as well. I obviously I didn't know Patrick Kavanagh, but I knew his brother Peter very well towards the end of his life, because I met him in certain circumstances, and we were in touch for several years, and we met quite a few times. And he was what Patrick called his sacred keeper. And it's, to me, the great untold story of Irish literature and Irish life in the middle part of the last century is the relationship between these two men and what they achieved. Just before Mary Louise reads her thing, I mean, Peter told me, Peter was 12 years younger than Patrick. And when Peter was 8, he decided, because Patrick was beginning to make hay as a poet, you know, he was making a name for himself, and he was hanging out with A. Russell and or A, as he used to call himself, and people like that, you know, and Peter said he started getting notions himself. You know, he was 8 years old, so he went to Patrick one day and he says, Patrick, he says, you know, I'm thinking of becoming a poet. And Patrick says, dead serious. He says, but you can't. You're only allowed to have one poet in any family. And Peter, at 8 years of age, said he went away and thought about this. And then he decided, he says, well, if that's the case, so be it. In that case, he says, I will serve Patrick's genius. And he did that every day of his life until he died in, I think, 2006 at the age of, gosh, what would he be? He was 96, I think, or 97. Every day of his life. He used to print. He actually built a printing press, talking about working with your hands and all that. In New York, he became a professor of poetry. He told me this as well. He became a professor of poetry because he said that even though Patrick was a genius, he was very ignorant about poetry. And Peter's fear was that Patrick would go around writing poems that had already been written by Dante and fellas like that, you know. So he learned about everything he could find out about poetry so as to become an advisor to Patrick and stop him making an idiot of himself. But he meant, when he was in New York and Patrick's work wasn't getting printed, he actually built a hand printing press himself with scrap metal that he found in the streets of New York, and he constructed it. It's now, to be fair, I think it's actually currently up in Inniskeen in the museum up there. It was he donated it to UCD because they have a museum there as well. And but Peter was, you know, he was the hand servant of Patrick. He was his sponsor. He was his financier. He was his muse. He was his editor. You know, and at the heart of their whole mission was what they called the flash. And this is a thing that Patrick had. That a poem was, Peter had a phrase actually, he said to me, which summed up, I asked him, well, what is a poem? What's the relationship between the words and the idea? And he said, in a poem, he says, the words are the least important part. He says, in a poem, the words burn up in a tremendous thread of something unusual. And I thought that was one of the most staggering definitions of a poem I'd ever heard. And that was about the flash. You can actually see, whoo. And that was the thing that Patrick said, it was like the flash was that the other entered in, that the other world entered into through the words. And you could see this flash of something that was beyond comprehension, some mysterious, you know, thing that you knew about intuitively, but you hadn't any evidence for, you couldn't support by any, you know, proofs but suddenly you said, it exists. And that was the function of the poet. And Peter told me that, you know, that was the test, that when Patrick would write a poem, that was the test. Did it have the flash? And they would each sit there and they would read the poem aloud. And then there was no. And it would be into the waste paper bin and start again. So the flash, I mean, which essentially tells us is that from Patrick Kavanagh's perspective, poetry was a religious, a spiritual activity. It wasn't. He said, what was it? He said that it's not literature, it's theology.
That's right.
That poetry was theology, not literature.
Right, with that, Máire Louise.
There were two extraordinary men.
Absolutely.
And John, thank you for that. Sorry, that was beautiful.
Beautiful. It's better than the poem itself. My God, John. I both of my tribe anyway, and I think John's tribe come from a part of the country which would be not the rolling hills of Tipperary, tough soil of Roscommon in County Mayo. And the poem is called Advent. I just read it. I don't know it off by heart, I'll just read it. We have tested and tasted too much, lover. Through a chink too wide there comes in no wonder. But here in the Advent darkened room, where the dry black bread and the sugarless tea of penance will charm back the luxury of a child's soul, we'll return to doom the knowledge we stole but could not use. And the newness that was in every stale thing when we looked at it as children, the spirit-shocking wonder in a black slanting Ulster hill, or the prophetic astonishment in the tedious talking of an old fool will awake for us and bring you and me to the yard gate to watch the winds and the bog holes, cart tracks, old stables, where time begins. Oh, after Christmas, we'll have no need to go searching for the difference that sets an old phrase burning. We'll hear it in the whispered argument of a churning, or in the streets where the village boys are lurching. And we'll hear it among the decent men too, who burrow dung in gardens, under trees, where life pours ordinary plenty. Won't we be rich, my love and I? And God, we shall not ask for reason's payment, the why of heartbreaking strangeness in deepening hedges, nor analyze God's breath in common statement. We have thrown into the dustbin the clay-minted wages of pleasure, knowledge, and the conscious hour, and Christ comes with a January flower. I think it's beautiful.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, theology. Theology.
It's gorgeous. It's gorgeous. It's beautiful beyond words. Beyond words. Well done. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
I hope we meet again. Are we off? Are
Should we sing the national anthem or something? No.
JD Mac. No, that was wonderful. Yeah, why don't we leave it at that? Maybe if Louise, I know you're very involved with that, obviously emotionally, and I don't want to, where you don't want to be taken, but if you wouldn't mind, maybe could you read that Cherry Blossom piece just to round us off completely? Okay. And John, this is just something.
I wrote it, but
Louise, I'll let you talk about it.
It's very simple. A magnificent cherry blossom tree was hacked down today, hacked and fell to the ground. It was butchered on National Tree Day. Imagine that. Butchered to a stump on National Tree Day when young children from Easy Treasy were up in the Irish planting a tree for the president. That is extraordinary, barbaric. The Dún Laoghaire Rathdown County Council came with their electric saws early in the morning. They came at the instigation of a neighbour who told them that the branches were getting in his way. There was no attempt to prune. There was no attempt to ask other of us who live alongside and beside such beauty whether it should happen. The branches were getting in the neighbour's way, and that was enough. And the cherry blossom is now a gigantic pencil stump. The cherry blossom stood on our road on a grass verge for 40 years, beautifully. The neighbour did not. It got us all through the awfulness of COVID in early spring when it spread its lily white and perfumed pink leaves over us like an angelic canvas. The children picked the scented leaves, bottled them tight with water, and sold us fresh perfume on the road. There's no perfume or movement from the stump. But a neighbour thought the branches were in the way and the cherry blossom is no more. It was raising the footpath, the council replied to my questioning. It was not, I said, and I sent them photos of the flat pavement truth. Who authorised it? Who said go ahead? Where was the reason and the conviction for the savagery? I can't get an answer, only untruths and loads of evasions. It wasn't me. But it raises huge and urgent questions about us all, and about adult citizens and organisational grown-up behaviours that are well below any kind of standard. Behaviours that are not qualitative, behaviours that have no value, behaviours that are meaningless, behaviours that are destructive. There's a kind of godlessness about such behaviours. Carelessness is always about godlessness. We have expectations about our children and our young population, the installation of values, the infusion of feeling and beliefs in the good and the best for them and others. But we lack those qualities in ourselves. It was adults who brought this about, mature adults, mature me, mature my way, mature entitlements, and mature carelessness took over, and others were left with beauty destroyed. David Attenborough has a new film. It's outstanding. But we are wasting our time looking at it if we don't look in our own mirrors. The mirror of the planet for us all is one of urgency, impact, and beauty, just like the cherry blossom. Our own mirror must be a parallel of that. What was instigated was allowed to happen, and happened to the graceful lung that was the cherry blossom on my road, is a single, poignant national and world example of how we have devastated and are continuing to devastate the natural, magnificent womb in which we live. Both my neighbour and the Dunleary Rathdown County Council should hang their heads in shame. Their mirrors will not reflect back the joy, the colour, the scent, and the splendour of the cherry blossom. Their mirrors will reflect a stumped value, a stumped imagination, and a stumped carelessness. Anyway, the Irish Times said they hadn't any space for that. So that was the end of that, John. I might send it to Substack.
I think we should set up your own Substack. I would say, Mary Louise, that nowadays to get a rejection from the Irish Times amounts to a compliment.
Thank you, John, and thank you for the hope on relation to COVID.
And let me just say, Mary Louise, this is the third time I'm teasing you about this, but it's maybe not a bad thing that John is present in the room, as it were, because I've said a number of times how you need to write your one-woman play, but maybe there could be a one-woman and a one-man play or something. Maybe the pair of you could
it'd be a very
collaborate.
Good idea.
It could work out really well, and it could have it in the place in Dunleary, isn't it? The pavilion or the 40 foot, what do they call that?
Yeah.
I can just happening, you know.
Yeah, so, it's a very, very good idea because
John the council as well, though. That pavilion is. Sorry, yeah,
it's what, John?
It's controlled by the council. I have to warn Mary Louise.
But yeah, Mary Louise, what
I don't think I think it's very interesting.
He's burned our boat.
No, but what you've said is a very interesting concept, because John caught me in one there earlier on that my arts background would be a background of the technique of communication, whether as an actress or a reader or whatever, as opposed to the underlying ideologies of how people think around it. I just take sometimes people's work and bring it to life, be it my own back of my head, or poets' work or playwrights' work. So it would be a very interesting combination to have somebody act out something and then have the thinker, you know, to actually bring it to another level. Do you know what I'm trying to say there? I know the combination that you're suggesting, Fergus, might be a winning one, and I need the money because the Vulture Fund are at the gate.
Well, it's a very interesting point because, you know, I mean, in a certain sense, in the culture of Irish art and literature, the whole idea of ideology and art is kind of a no, you know, it's
yes.
Yeah, but in fact, that's something that in other cultures isn't true. I mean, Eastern Europe, in Russia, these places, like, you know, the great writers were themselves, like Solzhenitsyn, you know, they were actually activists in a certain sense, you know, as well as being.
Yes.
And that's something I think that in the future, with the way things are going, that our art will have to become. It will have to move more, because it can't for very much longer sit on the sidelines, you know, doodling while Dublin burns. You know, I think that that, you know, there's an interesting moment coming for the arts in Ireland, that they have to sort of grow up and face reality and face the nature of modern world and how it's bearing down upon their people, because that's part of, I believe, what the artist's job is. And so, that is a very interesting thing. But nevertheless, of course, the big trap there, this is the point, that actually, if you go too much in one direction, you cease to be art. And I think Máire Louise gets that balance right, because she starts with technique, with craft, with understanding how things are transmitted, and how things are presented, and how they are electrified, as it were, so, because I would say, if anything, I mean, I've written some plays in the past, and I probably would have to put my hand up that I am a little bit too mechanical, in the sense of being, addressing social reality as opposed to existential reality, which I think which is a trap as well. And there's a balance that needs to be found there somewhere, not necessarily by me or you or either of us or any of them, but somebody will have to address this pretty soon, I think, in Irish culture terms.
And it's interesting that we're not getting, I said recently, I was giving a talk before the COVID, everything is before and after COVID now. I said, well, the theatre is dead. And there was a big, and I said, I don't mean that in a glorious way. I mean that in a very tragic way. People aren't going because Friel is not there. The great plays we're not really seeing the great plays. They're not coming onto the theatre. And when they are coming on, they're not being acted in a way that we believe. And then when you get something like Breaking Bad, or you have Netflix, which can maybe take what looks like a play, but is really a video playing, into your sitting room, it's very easy not to go and queue and go into the theatre where you can't really hear the actor because he's not properly trained. So there's been something has happened in the theatre as well, or it's all musical theatre, or it's become something else, that they mightn't have grown up. You're right, that we're not getting, there hasn't been no writer, as I see it, has come with the play that we're queuing round. We queued round to see the Mai, we queued round to see all the Friels, with Tom Murphy, the Geely concert, we queued. But we're not queuing. We're queued to see Chekhov. We will always queue to see Chekhov, and we will queue to see the greats. But we're not queuing to see a great Irish playwright. Maybe Enda, maybe the Weir, maybe a few. But at the moment, I'm talking about in the last maybe 15 years, we're not queuing.
Yeah, is that something to do with the fact that the sacramental aspect of theatre has been lost as a result of television? And that perfunctory relationship between cause and effect in that narrow form, dramatic form, which has kind of infected the theatre. And also, I think that the fear of appearing to be religious has infected the artistic class in general, but maybe writers in particular, that they run hundreds of miles away from anything that touches or hints at something sacred or transcendent, even though the very dynamism of the human person, regardless of whether you are of any religious belief or none, the dynamism of the human person is itself spiritual and cannot be otherwise, because that is what keeps us getting out of bed in the morning, going on in spite of everything, heading for that point on the horizon that somehow we intuit is leading us to somewhere great.
And John, that just phrase caught my attention. On the horizon. You finished, as I said to some people, the article I've ever seen you write about your being fed up with Catholicism, and you were. Do you remember? Do you know what I'm talking about? At the very end, I think it was the break for evil.
Yes.
And you said something about the horizon. Basically, you're going your own way. But anyway.
That's a bit, I suppose, reductionist in a way, because I'm kind of very much at a crossroads now in terms of how I see, because I've spent my life is divided up into parts: a very devout youth, a period of atheism, a return, and then I think a series of, we had the public disgraces of the church, and those of us who were inside the tent in that period had to basically take a lot of stick that didn't necessarily belong to us, but we took it and we defended insofar as we could those who we knew to be good within the church. And then, it just didn't seem to matter. I think the church now is very unforgiving of those who defended it in the past. And it seems that it wants to distance itself from them more than it does from its critics. Fine, I'm good with that. If that's the way it is, then it's no longer the church that I thought I knew, and I'm happy to wave bye-bye. But I do say this, that there's a profound problem now for Irish society insofar as that under various headings, and I'll just throw out 2 or 3, morality being the one that everybody talks about, but empathy, for example. There is a Christian empathy, hope, dynamism, desire. That these things are of their essence spiritual quantities, and that if you throw away if you put in the skip all of the stuff you think you can get rid of, you might find out in 3 weeks that actually something vital was attached to it, and that it's now too late to retrieve it. And I think that's a real danger for Irish society now, and that even under the narrow heading of morality, if you think about it, people think, they say, I can be moral without Christianity, I can be moral without God. Yes, you can, but can a society which has been trained in a particular model of morality and then abandoned it be moral, is another question. Because the problem is that there is a backlash against the morality. There is a reaction against it. And people think that they not alone can do without it, but that is actually a bad thing. And what you actually have as a result of that is a moral inversion, where what used to be regarded as good becomes bad, and what used to be regarded as bad becomes good.
And what's a moral inversion? Is a moral inversion that whole entertainment industry that we're all entertaining ourselves to death, as Postman says, is that to do with me? And is that to do with the present? And is that to do with the way I feel and I think and the way I believe in myself? Is that the moral inversion?
Yeah, certainly. Those are certainly aspects of it. I think it's quite a profound thing, whereby,
yes.
That like one of the things I've found over the years is that growing up as a Catholic and railing against all that, in many ways as a young man and so on, that as life went on and I started to experience more and more and look around me more and more and see how things really worked, I began to thought, those old guys, John Paul and Ratzinger and those guys, they had something going on there, they knew stuff. They had understood things that we kind of didn't really understand about human desire, for example, and hope, for example. These are things that people now think you can actually satisfy everything materially. That happens. You can generate hope as a kind of like, almost like just hope. This kind of thing where people say, "Oh, you're very pessimistic." So, well, if things are bad, I'm pessimistic, yes. But if they're not, I'm optimistic. But I'm not going to be optimistic just for the sake of it. And there is a lot of that people say, "Oh, you must look on the bright side. The glass is half full," they say. Well, it's also half empty. So, like, this is what I'm saying, that we don't seem to kind of have got to a point where we realize that if we're to get rid of all that stuff, we need to replace it with something. Some other value.
Well, I'll go back to your moral inversion, because I think that is a very interesting point. The Carmelites would say that it's only in the service of others that you find the best in yourself. That's one of their brilliant mottos, I think. It's a very,
yes.
I mean, you're back to public service, you're back to what Brian Lennon said, where the private has taken over, and the essence of the public or community can do, communion of saints, or the community can do for each other, has been lost or something. Or
you're also you're also onto something that, you know, the ancients understood implicitly, that, you know, only in serving others do you really find joy.
That's right.
You know, I found like when my daughter was young, you know, and I was in a kind of an irregular situation and intermittent kind of, as they used to appallingly call it, access. And, you know, because there were spaces in between and I was kind of going back to my bachelor lifestyle, I noticed in myself a kind of a resentment almost of the fact that I now had to be responsible for this next 5 days. And then I caught myself on because I noticed something very quickly, which was that at the end of the 5 days, when I was to drop my daughter back to school, and I'd be saying, okay, now I'm good for the next few days, I'm going on the town, you know, or whatever. Yeah. And then I would go drop her to school and I would go home and I would sit looking out the window for 2 hours and think, I wish she was coming back tonight. Because it was the actual engagement with her and with the responsibility of being her father and doing all the things, you know, cooking her dinner and preparing her lunches for school and reading her stories. That was the real joy of my life. Not the kind of harem-scarum stuff that I thought I wanted to do. And in a way, that's the kind of a perfect parable of what's happened to our culture now, where all the emphasis is on recreation and leisure and all this stuff. When in fact, the joy of life is in engagement with the sorrows and with the difficulties and the responsibility. I remember Ray McSharry once saying something in an interview that really caught my, when I was only young at the time, I read that. I thought it was a strange thing to say. He says, I hear people talking about their problems. He said, they're always giving out about their problems. But sure, what else is life but solving problems? And I thought, wow, that's a strange thing. Now I understand. I mean, I understood more recently than that, but you know, it's that's kind of the point, that we've kind of, one of the things we've done is we've decided that we have to be getting kicks all the time.
Yes, that's right.
Enjoying ourselves all the time, and you know, this kind of elevation of sex to being the highest value, as it were, in terms of pleasure in life, in reality. You know, I think that's a huge kind of imposition, and that's a reaction. That's what I'm talking about, part of the inversion.
One of the things that I found in COVID, one of the most, and if somebody said to me, what's your biggest memory of COVID? This is it. In the first lockdown of COVID, the Sikhs who live on the North Circular Road, who have these kitchens, the Sikhs are Sikh people, who are obviously immigrants to Ireland, they could be Irish nationals at this stage, started making food for the healthcare workers anywhere. And I thought to myself, well, there it is. Now, I'm not suggesting that people weren't doing it in 1,000 different communities, but the Sikhs were making it in pots the size of planets and bringing it out to people everywhere who needed the food. And I thought, these people know these people are extraordinary. We are privileged to have them in our country. This is extraordinary. It was just that whole service of others. Now, people are doing it. Irish people do it all the time, but they did more for what I would call, you know, integration in 5 minutes with a pot of soup than any sociological degree in different nations will do. I thought they were absolutely extraordinary. It's my one memory of these Sikhs in a big kitchen creating food for no money, no cost, no nothing, with their big, huge turbans on and their big pin, and they cooking the food. And I thought, my God.
Yeah, you see, I think this is something that we're going to have to think about very, very urgently soon, because artificial intelligence is going to wipe out a lot of the paid work.
Lot of this, yes.
Yeah, so we're going to have to kind of, I think, really start thinking about how we actually retain our identity as human persons, given that we come from a materialist society in which what you do is the uppermost thing about you. How are we going to, as it were, redistribute dignity among the people in that sort of culture? You see, that these are the questions which we should be talking about now, particularly in the shadow of the Great Reset and all this stuff, you know, Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum. These are questions which are looming very large. I mean, I've been reading about this stuff now for several years. It's a big, big question. And I mean, I was writing 30 years ago about universal basic income when it seemed like a good idea to kind of give people a basic wage, you know, every week, regardless of what they did. and then they could augment that in whatever ways they could, and then they would enter the tax system and so on. That at that time seemed to me a good idea. It doesn't now, because now it was likely to be accompanied by Chinese-style social credit systems where you're being spied upon all the time. And if you say a bad word about the government, you lose half your universal basic income, that kind of thing. So there's all these questions, which this is what journalism existed to talk about, and refuses to talk about it now. It refuses to talk about it. And it drove people like me out of it. I was driven out of journalism by journalists, not by anybody else, by other journalists, because they didn't like what I was saying. They didn't like the questions I was asking. And it seems to me a journalist who is driven out of journalism for asking questions was in the wrong job in the first place, because he was thinking that the job was to ask. I always thought the job of journalism, one of the most fundamental.
John, is that what they'd say? Is that what other journalists would say if I asked them?
I don't know what they would say. I mean, they would tell you some lies, I'm sure. But I think that if they're honest, that's what happened. I mean, I describe it in my book, Give Us Back the Bad Roads.
Yes, I read it. I read it. Yes, it was well documented in that, what happened.
Yeah, and as a tribute to the book, every single journalist in Ireland ignored it. Not a single word on any radio, television, or station or newspaper was there published. So that's a great compliment. Again, like the Irish Times turning down your poem. We should celebrate these
tiny little thing with about my 400 words. Because but I'm just interested in your moral inversion. I think that there's a book there. There's a book there.
Yeah,
the moral inversion.
I think there is, but. Yeah, I think it'll evolve very quickly now.
As to whether you want to go into the depression to actually, what was it John McGahern used to say, that when he thought about a play, or he thought about another book, or he thought about he'd go into a massive depression because he'd have to do it, and he'd just sit in a corner in a total depression and for days and days, because he knew he'd have to do it. So I don't want to gift you with a terrible depression.
Yeah,
because there is a book there. Because I have this, I think we have become kind of pornographic in our language, in our actions, even in music, in advertising, in marketing, in everything we do, is the capitulation to the bottoms, breasts, whatever. It is a capitulation to pornography, like the orangutan showing his bottom at the zoo, up against the cage. Yes. It never stops. The way people act, and it's confused. It's masquerading as liberation, and it's got nothing to do with it. It's got to do with this money, and it's an appalling indictment on the young child, with the awe and the astonishment in his poem. In Kavanagh's poem, all that wonderful beauty of young minds, and it's destroyed even in the eating of sweets. It's destroyed everywhere by pornography, which makes more money than oil.
Oh yeah, and it's a form of enslavement. It is enslavement, quite the contrary to what people think.
Absolutely, and it has enslaved women, and they think because they're running around with their breasts out and showing their bottoms in music videos that they are feminist and that they are liberal. It's got nothing to do with it.
Yeah, that's what I mean. That our value system, it's a reaction, to the religious past, and it's like everything. So if the religious people said X, we got to believe Y. That's kind of the ethic or anti-ethic, and I mean that's leading you to a terrible place if you let it. So that's kind of what I think.
It's become mainstream, and it's become boundaryless. It's boundaryless, and it's also ageless, and it has seeped over into 1,000 different walks of life. It's a part of a moral. I was just taken by that phrase, a moral inversion. I just thought that was an extraordinary phrase. That it could be a great book about what has happened.
Yeah, I think I've got writer's block.
Oh, I don't think so, John. I don't think you've got writer's block.
That's the only antidote. That's the only antidote.
Well, the way out of that is start with a series of articles on it.
Yeah, that's the antidote to McGahern's depression, writer's block. Acquire writer's block, you'll be safe.
Or procrastinate like I do. But I'm not a writer. But even if I have to write something, I'll go on about it for days until I have to do it. And then it has to be done. And sure, that's only about an 800-word little article, you know, and it would be really very, very simple. But I think you should write a series of articles on it, because I think it's a very interesting concept.
Well, to be fair, that seems to be what John is doing on the Substack. Like,
well, I will. Oh, well, that's fine. I'll read all that. I haven't been privy to that.
But and it's there for all to see. But John, I think you've said yourself, I don't want to misquote you there, but I think that maybe going towards a book anyway, and not that it's exactly about that phrase, Moral Inversion, but am I right in thinking that these pieces are going towards a bigger? Well,
I shouldn't say that, because publishers hate you when you.
Oh, jeez.
But certainly it's a testing out of certain ideas, and I think that, you know, I don't want to write a book about COVID.
No,
but I think
no.
I want to write a book about 2020 or 2020 to 20 whatever, you know, however long this nonsense is allowed to go on for, and that will depend on us. And because I think that actually at the heart of it is something crucial in our history, even though at a certain level it's a completely absurd thing. It's drawing out of our culture many of the most fundamental essences and making us look at them again. And I mean, Mary Louise touched on that question, is there something positive about it? Well, that's a weird kind of inverted positive, that actually these things that are happening will perhaps cause us to stop and consider where we've been and where we think we're going to. Because I don't think that we actually have any idea where we have been going. And I don't think we've actually made any claim to steering ourselves for quite a long time. We've let ourselves drift, and as a result of that, we fall into the hands of others who have very clear ideas about what they want. Because, you know, Ireland is a very attractive place to a lot of people now. We didn't believe this. See, we grew up thinking Ireland was a terrible, dark place and wasn't very interesting because none of the pop bands ever came here or anything, you know. And all the time there was these people looking, that's a fine place you have there, you know, if only you knew it. And that's what's kind of going on now, you know.
And you know, most people, but most people, the amount of people who want to come and live here, who can see our genius, you know, we can't see it ourselves. And we're kind of a bit, you know, we're a melancholic people too, you know, so we're great when we're giving out about ourselves.
I know, sure, isn't it interesting? It's more interesting.
We're great when we're giving out about ourselves. There's nobody better than to put a cross on our backs. And off we go, uptown. Off we go. Where is she? Uptown. Where is she? Appearing at knock. That was a great one. She's appearing at knock. And, you know, I mean, we're wonderful at melancholia and we're great at it. We're not as good about joy, you know, we because we don't think it'll last. Whereas the melancholia will last. It'll see us out, you know. But there.
Well, I think the weather trains us in that respect, because we always know, even on a fine day, it'll be raining tomorrow. You know?
It'll be raining tomorrow, yeah.
So, I mean, that's part of our personality. But I think it makes us interesting, you know, to ourselves anyway. Whether it makes us interesting to others is another question. But I mean, I think, you know, we're very good at psychoanalyzing ourselves and downwards, in a reductionist way. But I think that, you know, on balance, we have. This is, I would say what I say often to people these days. Now I'm 65 years of age, and I say to people, I've had a wonderful life in Ireland. It has been, I could not have, if I had chosen the country to be born in, I could not have chosen better. It's an absolutely stunningly beautiful country in so many ways. Its personality is so beautiful. Its history is so beautiful. Its music is beautiful. Its landscape is just exquisite.
Exquisite.
I mean, you know, and I want to preserve that. I want to keep that for my daughter and her children when they come, and for my step grandchildren. I want them to be happy in this country, as happy as I was in it. And I'm worried that that isn't going to be possible now because of the certain forces that are bearing down upon it. And that's why I run for office last year. It's why I'm fighting this COVID, whatever we'll call it. I'll be polite and just say matter. And that's why in 20 years I won't be worth talking about. I might as well try to protect this place, this country, this island, if I can, for whatever time I have left.
Right. If I may, I think we'll leave it there.
Okay.
But thank you both for 3 hours of
it was wonderful
stuff.
Conversation. Thank you, Fergus, for setting it up. I was very exhilarated and informed, and I loved every minute of it.
No, you
Me too.
to exchange your phone numbers afterwards in the green room. You know, we'll have to go off air and then, you know, do all that. But let me just ask, if anyone is watching, and I know there are some people watching, please do share the video with your friends and your foes and your family on all sorts of platforms. Send them a text, and just on those social media that we were talking about earlier, so that more people can see it. And I would very much appreciate that. Thanks again for watching. This is the last Lagos broadcast of 2020, and I look forward to doing many, many more in the months and years ahead. So if you don't mind, just hold on for a few seconds, because this video shaves off. When I stop it, it's going to shave off the end. So I'm going to leave a gap for about 15 or 20 seconds, stop it, and then we can chit chat afterwards. So thanks again. Ihoa.
Slán.
Slán.